I am Cassidy, 33 years old. My mother screamed at me to get out of her house, and the rest of my family cheered her on. I did not cry. I did not beg. Instead, the very next morning, I signed the ownership papers for an $87 million private island castle, paid for in full with cash, and walked away from them forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut toxic family members out of your life to protect your peace. The dining room of my parents' Connecticut estate was suffocatingly warm, filled with the scent of roasted turkey and the overwhelming stench of fake wealth. We were gathered for our annual Thanksgiving dinner, a tradition that had long ago morphed into a stage for my family to showcase their supposed superiority. I sat quietly at the far end of the long mahogany table, pushing a piece of glazed carrot around my plate. At the head of the table sat my father, Richard. He was nursing his third glass of expensive bourbon, nodding eagerly at whatever my brother-in-law was saying. My brother-in-law Jamal held court at the center of the table. Jamal is an African-American finance broker who never misses a chance to remind everyone in the room exactly how much money he claims to make. Tonight he was wearing a custom-tailored burgundy velvet suit that screamed new money, complete with a massive gold watch that he made sure flashed under the crystal chandelier every time he reached for his wine glass. "I just closed another offshore portfolio this morning," Jamal announced, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile. "We are talking high-yield dividends, the kind of numbers that would make your head spin, Richard. My firm is practically begging me to take a corner office." My mother Patricia beamed at him from across the table. She adjusted her pearls, a family heirloom she wore exclusively to remind people of our lineage. "That is absolutely spectacular, Jamal," she gushed. "It is so comforting to have a real provider in the family, someone with genuine ambition and financial intelligence." She did not even try to hide the pointed look she shot in my direction. I kept my face perfectly neutral, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. If only they knew the truth. My younger sister Brittany seized the opportunity to join the attack. At 29, Brittany was the undisputed golden child of the family. She was currently pregnant with her first child, a fact she used to demand constant attention and accommodation. She rested a manicured hand on her perfectly rounded belly and sighed dramatically. "It really is exhausting having a husband who is so successful," Brittany said, batting her eyelashes at Jamal. "But I suppose someone has to bring in the big bucks." "Tell me, Cassidy, are you still working that boring computer nerd job? Or did you finally realize there is no future in sitting in a dark room typing code all day?" I looked up from my plate, meeting my sister's condescending gaze. "I am a cybersecurity architect, Brittany. I build defense algorithms to protect data networks." She rolled her eyes, waving her hand dismissively. "Right, whatever. It is just so depressing to watch you waste your life. I mean, you are 33 years old. You are completely single. You live in some tiny apartment, and you spend your entire life staring at screens. Do you even have a retirement plan? Or are you just hoping mom and dad will support you forever?" The irony of her statement was so thick I could practically taste it. For the past 5 years, my family had been living a massive lie. My father's company was bleeding money, teetering on the edge of complete bankruptcy. My mother's lavish country club lifestyle was entirely funded by credit cards that were maxed out. And Jamal, the supposed financial genius, was drowning in debt. I knew this because I was the one quietly keeping a roof over their heads. I had set up an automatic payment system years ago to cover the mortgage on this very estate, just to keep my parents from ending up on the street. They convinced themselves that Richard's business was keeping them afloat, but the reality was that my boring computer job was their only lifeline. Furthermore, my career was not just a job, it was an empire. Just 2 days prior to this miserable Thanksgiving dinner, I had finalized a deal to sell my proprietary defense algorithm to a major military tech conglomerate. The payout was $500 million. I was sitting at this table as one of the wealthiest women in the state while my family mocked me in rented designer clothes. "You really should listen to your sister Cassidy," my mother chimed in, her voice dripping with fake concern. "It is embarrassing for us to explain what you do to our friends. When people ask about my daughters, I can spend hours talking about Brittany and Jamal. But you have no husband, no assets, and no real prospects. You are a massive disappointment to this family. My father grunted in agreement, swirling the bourbon in his glass. You threw away a perfectly good opportunity to go to medical school to play with computers, he muttered. Look at Jamal. That is what success looks like. You should be taking notes. Jamal chuckled, a deep, arrogant sound that grated on my nerves. Hey, not everyone is cut out for the big leagues, Richard. Some people are just meant to be worker bees. If you ever need a small loan to upgrade your laptop or whatever it is you use, Cass, just let me know. I can probably pull some petty cash from one of my minor accounts. I looked at Jamal, taking in his flashy suit, his arrogant posture, and the subtle bead of sweat forming near his hairline. A man who was truly secure in his wealth did not sweat when discussing it. I knew the signs of a failing finance bro. I knew the SEC investigations that usually followed men who talked too loudly about offshore portfolios. I smiled gently, placing my napkin on the table. I appreciate the offer, Jamal, I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm. But I think my laptop is functioning perfectly fine for now. Brittany scoffed, leaning her head on Jamal's shoulder. You are so stubborn, Cassidy. You would rather live like a peasant than admit we are right. Honestly, your negative energy is completely ruining my pregnancy glow. I do not even know why we invited you this year. I sat back in my chair, absorbing their insults, their condescension, and their blatant disrespect. They felt so powerful sitting in this crumbling mansion, attacking the only person who had ever actually protected them. They thought I was weak because I chose silence over shouting. They thought my lack of designer labels meant a lack of value. They had absolutely no clue that they were insulting a woman who could buy and sell their entire existence with a single phone call. I did not argue. I did not defend my career or my bank account. I just sat there memorizing every cruel word, every smug look, and every arrogant laugh. The tension in the room was thick, building toward a breaking point that they were blindly rushing toward. They were setting the stage for their own destruction, and I was more than happy to let them dig their graves a little deeper. The silence at the table was abruptly shattered by the sharp zip of my mother opening her designer handbag. Patricia reached inside and pulled out a crisp, heavy manila folder, tossing it onto the polished mahogany table. She pushed it with her perfectly manicured fingers, sending it sliding directly until it bumped against my dinner plate. What is this? I asked, my voice flat, not making a single move to touch the folder. It is a formal notice to vacate, Patricia said, taking a delicate sip of her wine. You have exactly 48 hours to clear your belongings out of the downtown condo. Leave the keys on the kitchen counter when you are done. I stared at the folder, then back up at my mother. The downtown condo was technically listed under the family trust to appease my father's obsession with controlling real estate assets, but I was the one who had paid the down payment. I was the one who transferred the mortgage amount into their accounts every single month for the last half-decade. You are evicting me, I stated, making sure the harsh words hung clearly in the air. Brittany shifted in her seat, resting both hands protectively over her pregnant belly, a gesture she weaponized constantly. We need the space, Cassidy. Jamal and I have been talking, and it makes perfect sense. We live out here in the suburbs, but with the baby coming, we need a city crash pad. A place close to Jamal's office for when he works late closing his massive deals. You are just a single woman doing nothing with her life. You do not need a 3-bedroom apartment in the city. It is family property, Richard added, pointing his heavy silver fork at me. And right now, the family requires it for actual priorities. Brittany is building the next generation. Jamal is bringing in real wealth. You are simply taking up space. I let out a short, hollow laugh. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. You mean the condo I have been paying the mortgage on for the last 5 years? It is in the family. Trust! Patricia snapped, her voice rising in defensive anger, her diamond bracelets clinking against the wood. Legally, it belongs to us. You have merely been paying rent, and now your lease is up. I looked at Brittany, whose smug smile was practically radiating off her face, and then at Jamal, who was swirling his wine with feigned disinterest. The anger I usually suppressed began to bubble closer to the surface, but I kept my tone perfectly controlled, masking the absolute fury brewing in my chest. This is fascinating, I said, leaning forward slightly. You want to kick me out of the home I pay for to give it to the sister who has never worked a day in her life, and the brother-in-law who needed my money just to get his business off the ground. Jamal slammed his wine glass down on the table, the dark red liquid splashing dangerously close to the rim. Watch your mouth, Cassidy. I built my firm from scratch. Did you? I shot back, locking eyes with him, because I seem to remember a very different narrative 3 years ago. I remember you and my father cornering me in this exact dining room, demanding I empty my personal savings account. $200,000, Jamal. That was the seed money you needed for your lucrative brokerage firm, because not a single legitimate bank in this state would approve your loan applications. Before Jamal could formulate a response, Brittany shrieked, leaning forward over her plate. How dare you bring that up? You owed us that money. I owed you, I asked, raising an eyebrow at my sister's ridiculous entitlement. Yes, Patricia shouted, her polite high society mask entirely gone, revealing the ugly narcissism beneath. You owed this family. You owed us for the absolute humiliation you put us through. We had secured your spot in the most prestigious medical program in the country. We bragged about you to everyone at the country club. And what did you do? You dropped out. You threw away a prestigious medical degree to become a computer geek. Richard's face turned a violent shade of red, the veins in his neck bulging as he backed up my mother. You embarrassed us, Cassidy. Funding your sister's lavish $300,000 wedding in the Hamptons and providing Jamal with his startup capital was the absolute least you could do to repay us for the shame you caused. We allowed you to live in that condo as a favor. I looked at the four of them, a perfect portrait of narcissistic delusion. They had completely rewritten history to justify their financial abuse. When I left medical school to pursue cybersecurity, it was not a failure, it was a pivot toward my true genius. But to them, anything that did not come with a traditional high society title was worthless. They had bullied, guilt-tripped, and manipulated me into draining my early tech earnings to fund their extravagant lifestyles, convincing themselves it was my punishment for non-compliance. So let me get this straight, I said, summarizing their absurd logic with clinical precision. I drained my savings for your wedding, Brittany. I bankrolled your husband's failing business because he was too much of a liability for a bank. I have paid the mortgage on that condo for 5 years. And your response to my financial support is to call me a disappointment and throw me out on the street to make room for a baby nursery. You are a disappointment, Patricia yelled, her chest heaving with dramatic indignation. Look at you, 33, alone, bitter, and working a dead-end job. Brittany and Jamal are the ones who actually contribute to society. They are the ones who matter. This house, the condo, everything belongs to the people in this family who actually build legacies. Jamal scoffed, adjusting his expensive velvet lapels with a look of pure disdain. Your little contribution back then was a pittance, Cass. I did you a favor by taking it, giving you a chance to be part of something bigger than your boring coding projects. But now it is time for the adults to take over the real estate. You have 48 hours, Richard barked, his voice echoing in the large, echoing dining room. I want your things out of that condo by Sunday night. If you are not gone, I will have security throw your belongings onto the pavement. The sheer hostility in the room was palpable. They were practically vibrating with malicious joy, thrilled to finally put the family outcast in her place. They expected me to break down. They expected me to cry, to beg, to promise I would try harder to earn their love. They wanted me to grovel for a place in their lives, to plead for a roof over my head. I looked at the eviction notice, then at the faces of the people who shared my blood but had never been my family. The urge to scream the truth at them was incredibly strong. I wanted to pull out my phone, show them my bank accounts, and watch their jaws drop as they realized they were evicting a woman who had $500 million sitting in liquid assets. But that would be too easy. That would give them the opportunity to pivot, to suddenly apologize, to try and manipulate their way into my new fortune. No, they deserved something much colder. They deserved to experience the exact devastation they were trying to inflict upon me. I took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch across the dining room until the discomfort became a tangible force. I looked at each of them, observing the desperate hunger in their eyes. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to shatter into a million pieces right there on the Persian rug. Patricia was leaning forward, her lips parted slightly, waiting for the first tear to fall. Brittany was practically bouncing in her seat with anticipation. "Are you deaf as well as useless?" Richard suddenly bellowed. The sudden explosion of his voice echoed off the high ceilings. He lost whatever fragile grip he had on his patience and slammed his heavy fist down onto the mahogany table. The impact was violent enough to make the fine china rattle and send a few drops of Jamal's expensive red wine spilling onto the pristine white tablecloth. I said, "You have exactly 48 hours," Richard roared, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You will stop acting like you are the victim here. You will go back to that condo, you will pack up your cheap clothes, and you will vacate the premises. You are a guest in the legacy that I built from the ground up, and your welcome has officially worn out." "Your legacy," I repeated softly, letting the word hang in the air. "Yes, my legacy." He spat back his face, turning an unhealthy shade of crimson. "The legacy of this family. A legacy that Brittany and Jamal are expanding while you sit around pressing buttons on a keyboard. You will leave the property spotless. If I find a single scratch on the walls or a single piece of your garbage left behind, I will personally send my security team to drag you out into the street. I will not have my pregnant daughter moving into a filthy environment." Brittany nodded vigorously, crossing her arms over her chest. "Honestly, Cassidy, you should be thanking us. We let you live the high life in a luxury downtown building for years. But you are just not city material. You belong in some depressing suburban studio where you can order takeout and code all night without bothering anyone important. And make sure you hire professional cleaners before you hand over the keys. I refuse to let my baby breathe in whatever cheap perfume you use." The sheer delusion was staggering. They had convinced themselves that they were my saviors, completely erasing the reality of my monthly bank transfers that kept the lights on in that very condo. Patricia sighed dramatically, picking up her wine glass with an air of aristocratic boredom. "It is for your own good, Cassidy. Maybe hitting rock bottom will finally force you to wake up and get a real job. Maybe you will finally realize that ignoring your mother's advice has consequences. I told you years ago that dropping out of medical school would ruin your life. Now look at you, being kicked out of your own family's property because you cannot afford to contribute." "I contribute plenty," I said, my voice eerily calm, despite the adrenaline pumping through my veins. Jamal let out a loud, mocking laugh that cut through the tension like a rusty blade. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out and adjusting the cuffs of his flashy burgundy velvet suit. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated condescension, the kind of look a billionaire might give a beggar on the street. "You contribute." Jamal chuckled, shaking his head as if I had just told the funniest joke in the world. "Oh, Cass, you really are living in a fantasy world. Paying a few utility bills or buying groceries does not mean you contribute. Real contribution is what I do. Real contribution is managing portfolios, moving millions of dollars across international markets, and securing generational wealth for this family. You do not even know what real money looks like." He reached into the inner pocket of his custom-tailored jacket and pulled out a thick silver money clip. It was stuffed with high-denomination bills, a blatant and tacky display of the wealth he loved to flaunt. He unclipped the stack with a practiced flick of his wrist and peeled off a single crisp $100 bill. He held it up between two fingers, waving it slightly so it caught the light from the chandelier. "I tell you what," Jamal said, his voice dripping with fake pity. "Because it is Thanksgiving, and because I am a generous guy, I am going to help you out. I know things are going to be tight for you now that you do not have a free ride anymore. I know someone with your income level is going to struggle to find a moving company on such short notice." With a flick of his wrist, Jamal tossed the $100 bill across the dining table. It fluttered through the air, drifting over the roasted turkey and the crystal glasses before landing squarely on my dinner plate, resting right on top of my untouched food. "Use it to rent a U-Haul," Jamal said, grinning broadly as Brittany giggled beside him. "Or maybe use it to put a down payment on a cardboard box. Just consider it an early Christmas present from the successful side of the family." "You are welcome." Patricia smiled approvingly at her son-in-law. "That is very generous of you, Jamal. I hope you appreciate this, Cassidy. It is more than you deserve after the attitude you have shown us tonight. I sat perfectly still, looking down at the crisp bill sitting on my plate. The symbolism of the moment was almost poetic. Here was a man secretly drowning in debt, actively being investigated for financial fraud, throwing $100 bill at a woman who had just deposited $500 million into a private offshore account. The irony was so potent I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud. They sat there, a circle of predators waiting for me to break. They wanted me to snatch the money in tears or perhaps scream and throw it back in his face. They wanted a show. They wanted the satisfaction of watching the scapegoat shatter under the weight of their collective cruelty. They were practically holding their breath, their eyes glued to my face, hungry for the emotional breakdown they felt they were owed. But I was not the same defenseless girl they had bullied into emptying her savings account years ago. I was not the scared college dropout who believed their venomous words. I was a completely different entity now, sitting quietly in their midst, holding the power to obliterate their entire existence. I stared at the $100 bill on my plate, committing this exact moment to memory, sealing their fate in my mind forever. I did not give them the satisfaction of a single tear. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not beg. The room was so quiet that the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. I picked up my pristine linen napkin and carefully dabbed the corners of my mouth, erasing any trace of the meal I had barely touched. Then, with deliberate and measured movements, I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the floorboards, a jarring sound that made Brittany flinch and clutch her pregnant stomach. I stood up to my full height, smoothing the front of my dark trousers. I looked down at the $100 bill resting on the gravy-smeared surface of my dinner plate. It was a pathetic, crumpled piece of paper that represented everything this family stood for: cheap theatrics and hollow dominance. I did not reach for it. I let it sit right there, soaking up the grease. My mother narrowed her eyes, clearly unsettled by my silence. She opened her mouth to launch another volley of insults, but my absolute stillness stopped her cold. People who are expecting a screaming match never know what to do with complete icy detachment. They had loaded their weapons, fired their best shots, and were now utterly baffled that I was not bleeding out on their dining room floor. I reached into the side pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers wrapped around the heavy metal keyring that held the access fob and the brass deadbolt key to the downtown condo. The very property they were supposedly evicting me from. The very property my monthly automatic bank transfers had kept out of foreclosure for half a decade. I drew the keys out slowly. The metallic jingle was the only sound in the suffocating dining room. I extended my arm and held the keys suspended directly over the center of the mahogany table, right above a sprawling arrangement of expensive autumn flowers my mother had undoubtedly charged to a maxed-out credit card. I let them drop. The heavy keys hit the polished wood with a sharp, resounding clack that made Jamal blink in surprise. "There are your keys," I stated, my voice completely devoid of inflection. "I will not be needing the full 48 hours. Consider the condo officially vacated as of this exact second. You can send your cleaning crews whenever you like. Just be sure to tell them to wipe down the illusions of grandeur while they are at it." Richard scoffed, loudly attempting to regain control of the room. "Good," he barked, aggressively adjusting his collar. "I am glad you finally decided to stop being difficult and accept reality. Do not think you can come crawling back here when you realize you cannot afford a security deposit anywhere else." I ignored my father entirely. My gaze shifted past his red, furious face and locked directly onto Jamal. The self-proclaimed financial genius was still grinning, but the smile did not quite reach his eyes. There was a faint shadow of unease creeping into his posture. I leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on the back of my dining chair. "I hope your finance deals are as good as you say, Jamal," I said, making sure every single syllable carried crystal clear precision. "Because property taxes are due next week." The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a brief, involuntary flicker of panic. He knew, and I knew that he knew, that his offshore accounts were a complete fabrication. He opened his mouth to retort to throw another insult about my computer job, but I did not give him the chance. I turned on my heel and walked away. "Oh, look at her!" Brittany sneered loudly from the table, her voice trailing after me down the hallway. The classic Cassidy dramatic exit. She will be calling Mom crying by tomorrow morning asking for grocery money. "Let her go," Patricia chimed in, sounding immensely satisfied. "The fresh air will do this family some good." I did not look back. I did not pause at the door. I walked straight out of the dining room through the opulent foyer and out the heavy oak front doors into the freezing November night. The bitter wind hit my face, but it felt incredibly refreshing. I walked down the sweeping driveway toward my car, a modest sedan I drove specifically to avoid drawing attention to my wealth. Behind me, the muffled sounds of their laughter drifted through the large bay windows of the estate. They were toasting to their victory. They were celebrating the successful expulsion of the family failure. They truly believed they had won. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and turned on the heat. As I backed out of the driveway and shifted into gear, a genuine smile finally broke across my face. I watched their crumbling, debt-ridden mansion shrink in my rearview mirror. They had absolutely no idea that the property tax warning was not a petty insult. It was a countdown. I merged onto the highway, heading back toward the city, leaving them trapped in their delusions of grandeur. My mind was no longer on their pathetic Thanksgiving dinner. It was entirely focused on tomorrow morning. While they would be waking up in a house they could not afford to heat, nursing hangovers from wine they bought on credit, I would be sitting in a sleek Manhattan high-rise. I would be holding a premium fountain pen signing my name to an $87 million property deed. The cold night air whipped past my windshield as I accelerated down the interstate. I did not feel homeless. I did not feel abandoned. I felt powerful. They wanted me out of their house, and I had obliged. But when the clock struck midnight, and my automatic bank transfers officially ceased to exist, they were going to learn a very hard lesson about who was actually keeping a roof over their heads. My finger hovered over the proverbial launch button of their total financial destruction, and I could not wait to press it. The morning sun sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 60th floor boardroom in Midtown Manhattan. The light bounced off the sleek glass table, completely blinding in its clarity. It was exactly 9 o'clock on Friday morning. While my family was likely still asleep in Connecticut, nursing their wine hangovers, and congratulating themselves on securing a tiny downtown condo, I was sitting across from three of the most high-powered real estate attorneys on the East Coast. The contrast between my parents' decaying estate and this room was staggering. There were no fake antique vases here, no forced displays of aristocratic heritage. This room smelled of rich espresso-polished leather and absolute undeniable power. My lead counsel, a sharp-eyed man named Donovan, slid a thick leather-bound folio across the glass table. He tapped the top page with an expensive silver pen. "The wire transfer cleared 5 minutes ago." Cassidy Donovan stated, his voice a low, steady hum of professionalism. $87 million transferred entirely in cash. There is no financing involved, no contingencies. The funds have been successfully routed from your primary holding account directly to the seller's escrow. Island Castle is officially yours. I picked up the silver pen. It felt heavy and substantial in my hand. I looked down at the deed. Island Castle was not just a piece of real estate. It was a literal fortress perched on a private island off the northeastern seaboard, complete with stone battlements, a private helipad, and a state-of-the-art security grid. It was the ultimate isolated paradise, originally built by a reclusive industrialist. Now it belonged to me. I signed my name on the dotted line with a smooth, continuous stroke. Donovan reviewed the signature and nodded, passing the document to his associates for notarization. "I must admit," Donovan said, allowing a rare brief smile to break his professional facade, "executing an all-cash transaction of this magnitude is unusual even for this firm. The military tech acquisition certainly changed your portfolio overnight." I set the pen down and leaned back in my leather ergonomic chair. The acquisition he referred to was the culmination of my life's work. My family thought I was just a low-level coder tapping away at a laptop in a dark room. They completely missed the fact that my independent cybersecurity firm had spent the last 6 years developing a quantum-resistant encryption algorithm. 2 days ago, a global military defense conglomerate had finalized their acquisition of my software. The purchase price was $500 million. $500 million had landed in my accounts while my mother was busy critiquing my wardrobe. My boring computer nerd job had literally changed the landscape of national security, but the money meant nothing to me if it brought unwanted attention, especially from the parasites who shared my last name. Is the anonymity protocol fully intact? I asked, turning my attention back to Donovan. Airtight, Donovan replied, pulling a second, much thinner folder from his briefcase. We have buried the purchase under a labyrinth of 3 separate offshore shell corporations. As far as the public record is concerned, Island Castle was acquired by an unnamed international holding group. Even the seller has no idea who you actually are. We just need your signature on these non-disclosure agreements to bind the real estate agents and the escrow firm. I took the pen again and signed the ND as rapidly. Absolute secrecy was non-negotiable. I knew exactly how financial predators operated because I had grown up in a house full of them. If Richard or Jamal caught even a faint whisper that I possessed $500 million, they would launch a relentless campaign of legal harassment, fake apologies, and emotional blackmail to drain me dry. The eviction last night was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. By throwing me out, they severed the final psychological tether I had to their toxic ecosystem. I owed them absolutely zero explanations, zero favors, and zero mercy. Donovan collected the signed NDAs and placed them securely in his briefcase. Congratulations, Cassidy. The keys to the island will be delivered to your temporary hotel suite this afternoon. The estate manager and the private helicopter crew are already on retainer and awaiting your instructions. I looked out the massive window, watching the tiny yellow taxis crawling like insects far below on the Manhattan streets. My mind drifted back to the eviction notice sitting on my mother's dining room table and the ridiculous $100 bill Jamal had thrown at my plate. This was the moment of divergence. My family was busy celebrating a false victory built on a foundation of unpaid bills and massive ego. They thought they had successfully discarded the weakest link. They thought their social standing was secure. But they were entirely dependent on a financial pipeline that I had just permanently severed. The cold reality was about to hit them like a freight train. Without my automatic bank transfers quietly subsidizing their lifestyle, their entire world was going to collapse. I did not need to scream or fight to get my point across. I simply needed to step out of the way and let gravity do the work. I stood up and buttoned my bespoke suit jacket. I shook hands with the legal team, the physical weight of my new reality settling perfectly onto my shoulders. I had walked into this building as a disowned daughter, a supposed failure who had been kicked to the curb. I was walking out as a shadow billionaire, the owner of a fortified island, and the silent architect of my family's impending financial ruin. I walked toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, feeling an incredible rush of adrenaline. Let them enjoy their fake victory for the weekend. Let them post their smug photos and boast to their country club friends. They had no idea that the timer had already hit 0. 200 miles away, entirely oblivious to the monumental shift in power that had just occurred in Manhattan, my sister was busy broadcasting her delusion to the world. Brittany stood in this grand foyer of our parents' Connecticut estate, holding her phone high to capture her best angle for an Instagram live broadcast. She was wearing a silk maternity robe that likely cost more than a standard mortgage payment, her hair perfectly styled in loose waves. Jamal stood right behind her, holding a chilled bottle of imported champagne and 2 crystal flutes. "Welcome to our Friday morning, everyone," Brittany chimed into the camera, blowing a kiss to the hundreds of followers tuning in. "Jamal and I are just celebrating some massive family news. We are officially expanding our real estate portfolio." Jamal popped the cork on the champagne with a loud theatrical bang. The golden liquid spilled over the edges, staining the expensive imported rug beneath their feet. He poured the drinks, handing one to Brittany, who held it purely as a prop. "That is right," Jamal said, stepping into the frame and wrapping his free arm around Brittany. We just reclaimed a prime piece of downtown property. You have to make ruthless business decisions when you are building a legacy for the next generation. Sometimes that means cleaning house and kicking the dead weight out to the curb. Brittany laughed, a sharp grating sound that echoed off the marble floors. It is all about curating your energy. We simply could not tolerate a toxic, unmotivated tenant taking up space that belongs to our growing family. Our new city crash pad is going to be completely gutted and renovated. I am thinking imported Italian marble for the nursery bathroom. They clink their glasses together, performing the roles of a wildly successful power couple. The comments section on her phone screen flooded with heart emojis and praise from fellow social climbers who bought into their carefully manufactured facade. They genuinely believed their own lies. They felt invincible, entirely unaware that the downtown condo they were bragging about was already slipping through their fingers. And the champagne they were wasting had been purchased on a credit card that was quietly suffocating under compound interest. While Brittany and Jamal performed for their digital audience, my mother was busy orchestrating her own reality distortion field a few miles away at the Wellington Country Club. Patricia sat at a prime table on the sunlit terrace, surrounded by three of the wealthiest, most judgmental socialites in the state. She was dressed in a pristine white tennis skirt and a cashmere sweater draped elegantly over her shoulders. She held a silver spoon, delicately stirring a cup of Earl Grey tea as she held court. It really was the only sensible decision, Patricia said smoothly, leaning in to share her fabricated gossip. Richard and I simply had to put our foot down. We have given Cassidy every opportunity to succeed, but some people simply refuse to elevate themselves. One of her friends, a woman dripping in diamonds, gasped in mock sympathy. It must be so exhausting for you, Patricia, having one child who is so brilliant and another who just refuses to launch. Oh, it is a tragedy, Patricia sighed dramatically, placing a hand over her heart. But we had to evict her from the city property. Jamal is doing so incredibly well at his brokerage firm, and with the new baby coming, they desperately needed the downtown space for his late-night executive meetings. We simply could not allow Cassidy to drag the family brand down any longer. We sent her packing. I told her she needs to figure out her own life without riding on our coattails. The women murmured their approval, validating my mother's twisted narrative. Patricia reveled in the attention, soaking up their admiration like a sponge. She signaled the waiter with a snap of her fingers. "Bring us a bottle of your best vintage sparkling rose," Patricia ordered without even glancing at the menu. "Put it on my tab. We are celebrating new beginnings today." The waiter nodded and hurried off, entirely unaware that Patricia's tab was a ticking time bomb. She sat back, crossing her legs and smiling warmly at her friends. She felt like a queen ruling over a prosperous kingdom. She truly believed that throwing me out had secured her social standing and shielded her from any scrutiny. She thought she had successfully hidden the rot eating away at our family foundation by sweeping me under the rug. Meanwhile, Richard was pacing the perimeter of the country club parking lot, far away from his wife's glamorous brunch. His face was slick with a cold sweat, and he was aggressively chewing on an unlit cigar. He held his phone pressed tightly to his ear, listening to the agonizing sound of an automated banking menu. He was trying to verify the available credit limit on his primary corporate card. His manufacturing company had missed 2 major vendor payments that week, and the suppliers were threatening to halt all shipments. Richard wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, waiting for the robotic voice to deliver the final number. When the automated system finally rattled off his available balance, Richard closed his eyes and let out a shaky breath. It was less than $5,000, barely enough to cover payroll, let alone the massive material invoices piling up on his desk. But instead of facing the music, Richard shoved his phone back into his pocket and straightened his posture. He slapped a fake, confident smile onto his face and marched back toward the country club terrace to join his wife. They were all dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, completely mesmerized by the band, ignoring the water rushing in around their ankles. Their arrogance was so blinding that they never stopped to ask themselves how their extravagant lifestyle had magically sustained itself for so long, despite their mounting failures. They never questioned why the bank had never called about the downtown condo mortgage. They never wondered how their utility bills always stayed out of the red. They were entirely drunk on their own delusions, broadcasting their fake victories to the world, while their actual financial safety net had just walked out the door. The contrast between their loud, expensive boasting and the hollow reality of their bank accounts was almost poetic. They had spent the entire morning celebrating my departure, totally ignorant of the fact that I was the only structural pillar keeping their fake empire from collapsing into dust. Their champagne was poured, their lies were told, their social media posts were live. Everything was perfectly aligned for the most devastating reality check of their lives. The leather seats of the sleek black town car were buttery and pristine, offering a quiet temperature-controlled sanctuary away from the chaotic noise of Manhattan traffic. I sat in the back watching the towering skyscrapers reflect the late morning sun as my driver navigated toward the private marina on the East River. A luxury transport vessel was currently idling at the dock, waiting to ferry me to the coastal helipad, where my private chopper stood ready for the final flight to Island Castle. I leaned back against the headrest, enjoying the absolute silence within the soundproofed cabin. The contrast between my current reality and the pathetic, loud boasting of my relatives could not have been more extreme. While they were busy shouting their fabricated wealth into the void of social media, I was executing a financial demolition in total calculated silence. I reached into my designer tote and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. A quick biometric scan unlocked the screen, and I bypassed my newly minted offshore portfolio, entirely navigating instead to my oldest, most mundane checking account. The screen loaded, displaying a digital ledger that I had maintained for over half a decade. This was the account my family knew nothing about, yet it was the exact account that had been artificially inflating their lungs for 5 years. I scrolled down to the scheduled transfers section, bringing up the master list of recurring payments. At the very top of the screen sat the largest parasite of them all, an automated wire transfer of $15,000 scheduled to deploy on the first of every single month, routed directly to a prime lending bank. The memo line simply read, Connecticut Estate. 5 years ago, before Jamal ever entered the picture and before Brittany got married, Richard had called me in the middle of the night, weeping uncontrollably in his mahogany study. His manufacturing company had taken a massive hit, and the bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on the family mansion. He begged me to help, promising it was just a temporary cash flow issue. I had just secured my first major cybersecurity contract, and against my better judgment, I stepped in. I negotiated a strict forbearance agreement with the lenders and set up a blind trust to handle the monthly payments, allowing Richard to save face. He told Patricia and Brittany that a brilliant new business investment had saved the house. They never knew that the unmotivated, boring computer nerd was the only reason they were not sleeping in a motel. Over the years, Richard conveniently forgot where the money was coming from. He began to believe his own lies, treating me with the same disdain as the rest of them, confident that I would never pull the plug because I cared too much about family loyalty. He mistook my silent financial support for weakness. I stared at the active $15,000 recurring transfer. This payment was the invisible shield protecting them from the brutal reality of their own failures. Because the mortgage was under a specialized forbearance program, missing even a single scheduled payment would instantly void the agreement. The bank would not send a polite reminder. They would immediately demand the entire balloon payment of the outstanding principal plus half a decade of accumulated late fees and penalties. My thumb hovered over the glowing red button on the screen. There was no hesitation. There was no lingering guilt. They had made their choice when they handed me an eviction notice and threw a $100 bill at my face. I tapped the screen. A confirmation window popped up asking if I was absolutely certain I wanted to permanently delete this recurring wire transfer. I pressed confirm. The screen refreshed. The Connecticut estate payment vanished from the ledger. The digital umbilical cord was officially severed. It was done. A wave of profound, intoxicating relief washed over me. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 5 years. But I was not finished. If I was going to clean house, I was going to scrub it down to the studs. I scrolled further down my list of automated payments and found the telecommunications bundle. Years ago, Patricia had convinced me to upgrade my personal cell phone plan to a premium family package, claiming it was just easier for accounting purposes if all the lines were consolidated. Over time, they added Brittany and then Jamal, upgrading to the newest smartphones every single year without ever offering to split the bill. I was paying nearly $900 a month so they could post their delusional luxury lifestyle content on high-speed data networks. I logged into the telecom provider portal. I selected the Family Management tab and checked the boxes next to Patricia, Richard, Brittany, and Jamal. I did not just pause their data. I selected the option to permanently disconnect and close the lines. The system warned me that this action could not be undone and that their numbers would be released back into the network pool. I clicked execute. Right at that very second, miles away at a country club and a suburban mansion, 4 premium smartphones simultaneously lost all cellular service. Their Instagram live streams would cut to black. Their arrogant text messages would fail to send. They were completely severed from the grid. I kept going. Next on the chopping block was the shared insurance policy. It included the premium comprehensive coverage for Richard's imported Mercedes and Brittany's luxury SUV. They drove vehicles they could not afford to buy, protected by insurance they did not pay for. I navigated to the policy management dashboard and removed every vehicle except my own modest sedan. I followed that immediately by logging into the health and dental insurance portal, stripping them off the premium riders I had financed to cover Patricia's expensive elective dermatology appointments. Click by click, tap by tap, I dismantled the invisible infrastructure of their lives. I stripped away the mortgage, the communications, the vehicle protections, and the medical safety nets. In less than 10 minutes, sitting in the quiet luxury of a moving town car, I had completely financially orphaned them. The town car gently slowed to a halt, pulling smoothly up to the private docks of the marina. The driver stepped out and opened my door, the crisp, salty air of the East River rushing in to greet me. I stepped out onto the pavement, slipping my designer sunglasses over my eyes. I looked down at my phone one last time. My checking account now showed 0 pending outbound transfers. All the leeches had been successfully removed from the host. I slid the phone into my pocket, feeling lighter than air. I walked toward the dock where the sleek, polished transport boat was waiting to carry me to my new empire. The retaliation had officially been set into motion, and the beauty of it was that I did not have to lift another finger. The automated systems of corporate America were about to descend on my family like a pack of starving wolves. All I had to do now was sit back on my private island and watch the carnage unfold. While I was cutting through the freezing Atlantic waves on a luxury speedboat, sipping sparkling water and feeling the salty breeze on my face, the first shockwave struck the Connecticut estate. The automated systems I had unleashed did not care about holiday social standing or family pride. They operated with ruthless, algorithmic precision. It was Tuesday morning. Richard was standing in the grand foyer of the mansion, nursing a bitter cup of black coffee and a mounting headache. His manufacturing company was already bleeding cash, and he was mentally rehearsing which suppliers he could delay paying for another week. His self-pity was interrupted by a sharp, aggressive knock at the heavy oak front doors. Richard opened the door, expecting a delivery driver with one of Patricia's overpriced online purchases. Instead, he found a uniformed courier holding a thick, rigid cardboard envelope. The courier did not smile. He simply extended a clipboard and a pen, demanding a legal signature for a certified delivery. Richard scrawled his name with an irritated sigh, annoyed that a service worker was demanding his attention before 10 in the morning. He closed the door, walked into his mahogany study, and tore open the cardboard envelope. Inside was a stack of dense legal documents bearing the unmistakable embossed logo of Prime Lending Bank. Richard adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the bold capitalized letters at the top of the first page. Notice of default and immediate acceleration of debt. His annoyance instantly dissolved into a cold, paralyzing dread. He gripped the edge of his massive desk, his eyes darting across the paragraphs of unforgiving legal jargon. The letter outlined the catastrophic reality in brutal detail. The specialized forbearance agreement that had protected the estate for half a decade was officially terminated, due to the revocation of the third-party auto-pay mandate. Because the safety net was gone, the bank was no longer extending grace. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs as he reached the bolded financial summary at the bottom of the page. The bank was demanding an immediate balloon payment of the outstanding principal combined with 5 years of deferred late fees and unpaid property taxes. The total amount due to halt the active foreclosure proceedings was $120,000. The payment was required by the end of the business week. A cold sweat broke out across Richard's forehead. $120,000. He did not have $20,000, let alone $120,000. His personal accounts were running on fumes, and his corporate accounts were actively overdrawn. Panic, raw and unfiltered, gripped his throat. He reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out his premium smartphone. He needed to call his private wealth manager at the bank immediately. He needed to scream at them, threaten to move his non-existent assets, and demand they fix this clerical error. He dialed the number and pressed the phone to his ear. Instead of a ringing tone, he was met with dead silence. He pulled the phone away and looked at the screen. The signal bars in the upper right corner were completely gone, replaced by a stark warning that read, "No service." Richard frantically tapped the screen, toggling the airplane mode on and off, but the network connection remained dead. His premium unlimited data plan simply did not exist anymore. Before he could process this technological failure, the heavy doors of his study swung open. Patricia stormed into the room, her face pale and her hands clutching a printed email. She was wearing her silk morning robe, but she looked entirely unhinged. "Richard, what is going on with our accounts?" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "My cell phone is completely dead. I had to connect to the house Wi-Fi just to check my email, and I just received a cancellation notice from the auto insurance provider. They dropped the coverage on my Mercedes and Brittany's SUV. They said the master policyholder revoked the authorization." Richard stared at his wife, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with terrifying clarity. The revoked bank transfers, the disconnected cell phones, the cancelled insurance policies. It was a synchronized total infrastructure collapse. A sickening realization washed over him. The invisible benefactor who had saved this house 5 years ago, the mysterious account that had silently paid their bills while they boasted about their wealth, was not some magical business investment. It was Cassidy, the daughter he had just forcefully evicted, the woman he had called a useless disappointment. He refused to say her name out loud. His fragile ego simply could not handle the crushing humiliation of admitting that his rejected daughter was the sole architect of his survival. He shoved the thought down, replacing his shame with desperate, frantic action. "I will handle it," Richard barked, though his voice lacked its usual commanding boom. "It is just a bank error, a temporary glitch." He sat down at his computer monitor, booted up his desktop interface, and opened a Wi-Fi calling application. He had no time to coddle Patricia or worry about the cars. He had exactly 3 days to come up with $120,000 in liquid cash, or the bank would place a padlock on those giant oak doors and throw them out into the street. There was only one person in his immediate circle who claimed to have access to that kind of capital. The man who had sat at the Thanksgiving table waving a $100 bill and boasting about high-yield dividends. Richard typed in Jamal's phone number with shaking fingers. He waited as the digital dial tone rang through the computer speakers. It rang 4 times before Jamal finally answered. Jamal's voice sounded tight, lacking the smooth, arrogant cadence he usually projected. "Jamal, it is Richard," he said, forcing his tone to sound like a minor inconvenience rather than a desperate plea for salvation. "We have a slight administrative issue with the estate's primary mortgage account. The bank is being incredibly tedious about a routing error, and they are demanding a lump sum to clear the ledger." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. Richard could hear Jamal's breathing shallow and rapid. "What kind of lump sum?" Jamal asked cautiously. $120,000, Richard stated. "I need you to transfer a fraction of those massive profits you were talking about at dinner. Liquidate whatever offshore portfolio you need to, but I need a cashier's check or a direct wire to Prime Lending Bank by Friday morning. We will consider it an early investment in your future inheritance." The silence that followed was agonizing. Richard gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. He was throwing all his chips onto Jamal's table, entirely oblivious to the fact that he was begging a drowning man for a life raft. He had no idea that the man on the other end of the line was currently staring at his own frozen bank accounts, sweating through his designer shirt as the walls of a federal investigation closed in around him. Jamal swallowed hard, tasting bitter bile at the back of his throat. The silence on the line had stretched a second too long. He forced a deep, resonant laugh from his chest, pouring every ounce of fake, arrogant confidence he possessed into the receiver. 120 grand, Richard Jamal asked, his voice dripping with feigned amusement. Is that all? You sounded like someone died. Jamal leaned back in his plush leather chair, though his knees were violently trembling under his heavy glass desk. Listen, Richard. You know I would cover that in a heartbeat to protect the family asset. But I just locked my primary capital into a massive 5-year offshore bond in the Caymans yesterday afternoon. It is highly illiquid right now. Breaking that bond today would trigger a massive penalty fee. Let me make a few discreet calls and see if I can move some secondary assets around. Just sit tight. Richard thanked him profusely, the desperation practically oozing through the phone speaker. Jamal ended the call and immediately dropped his smartphone onto the desk as if the device had burned his hand. The forced smile instantly melted off his face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. Sweat beaded heavily on his forehead, rolling down his temples and staining the stiff collar of his custom-tailored silk shirt. The central air conditioning in his expansive corner office was blasting cold air, but Jamal felt like he was suffocating inside a locked oven. He ripped open the top drawer of his desk and pulled out his designer leather wallet. He grabbed his prestigious black metal credit card, the exact card he had casually slammed down at 5-star steakhouses to impress his gullible clients. He opened his banking portal on his sleek desktop monitor and typed in his login credentials with slick, clammy fingers. A glaring red banner dominated the monitor screen. Account suspended. Contact your institution immediately for further instructions. Jamal cursed aggressively under his breath. He grabbed his platinum business card, his hands shaking so badly he dropped it twice on the glass desk. He typed those numbers into a secure payment portal, desperately trying to wire a $10,000 retainer fee to his criminal defense attorney. Declined. He tried a third credit card, a personal line of credit he kept hidden from Brittany. Declined. Jamal buried his face in his hands, pulling hard at his meticulously faded hair. The facade was officially dead. There were no high-yield dividends. There were no offshore portfolios. The entire boutique brokerage firm he bragged about at every family gathering was nothing more than a glorified Ponzi scheme built on predatory management fees and illegally leveraged client funds. He unlocked the bottom drawer of his heavy filing cabinet and pulled out a thick, terrifying stack of legal documents bound by a tight rubber band. At the top of the pile was a formal, undeniable subpoena from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal government had been quietly investigating his firm for 8 grueling months. They had successfully frozen his domestic bank accounts exactly 48 hours ago. He was not a financial prodigy. He was a desperate thief who had embezzled nearly $3 million simply to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth. He had purchased the velvet suits, leased the luxury sports cars, and funded Brittany's extravagant country club lifestyle using completely stolen money. He was entirely broke. His net worth was severely in the negatives, and federal prosecutors were currently preparing an indictment that carried a minimum sentence of 15 years in federal prison. Jamal stared out his office window at the bustling city traffic below, his vision swimming with sharp panic. He had married into Brittany's family, specifically assuming they possessed deep, untethered generational wealth. He had planned to use Richard's manufacturing company as a legitimate corporate front to quietly wash some of his misappropriated funds before the feds noticed the missing money. But Richard was just as broke as he was. The entire family was a parade of pathetic frauds, propping each other up with empty boasts and maxed-out credit lines. They were all drowning, grasping at each other for a rescue that did not exist. A horrifying realization struck Jamal like a physical blow to the chest. The only person in their entire orbit who possessed actual legitimate liquidity was Cassidy. the quiet, unassuming sister he had mercilessly mocked, the woman whose face he had arrogantly thrown a $100 bill at less than 24 hours ago. Cassidy had been paying the mortgage. Cassidy had been the only structural beam keeping the roof over their heads, and they had just proudly kicked her out onto the street. Jamal felt a violent wave of nausea wash over him. He grabbed a small, polished trash can from under his desk and wrenched his stomach completely empty. He wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling hand, his breathing ragged. He could not tell Brittany. She was busy doing maternity photo shoots and bragging to her internet followers about their fake wealth. If she knew the money was gone, she would turn on him instantly. Patricia and Richard would throw him directly to the federal wolves to save their own crumbling reputations. They would loudly claim they were victims of his deceit, entirely ignoring their own financial ruin. Jamal unclasped the massive gold watch from his wrist. It was a heavy, ostentatious piece he used to project dominance in boardrooms. He weighed it in his hand, calculating how much a luxury pawnbroker would give him for it. He needed cash to survive the weekend. He needed a miracle. He needed a massive injection of pure, untraceable cash to pay off his most aggressive, dangerous clients before they went to the authorities, and he desperately needed a huge retainer for a lawyer who could keep him out of a federal cell. He stood up, pacing the length of his office like a trapped animal. He needed a billionaire. He needed someone with so much disposable capital that they would not look too closely at the fraudulent numbers he planned to present in a desperate pitch deck. While Jamal was pacing his office trying to conjure a billionaire savior out of thin air, his mother-in-law was blissfully unaware that her social execution was about to commence. Patricia sat on the sunlit terrace of the Wellington Country Club, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. The empty bottles of vintage sparkling rose and the remnants of lobster salad sat between her and her three wealthy friends. She laughed a high and practiced sound, finishing a story about her impeccable interior design tastes. The women smiled back, their eyes cold and calculating, measuring Patricia's worth by the very lunch she was about to pay for. Patricia caught the eye of the head waiter and waved her hand dismissively. "Bring the check, please. We are finished here." The waiter approached within seconds, placing the black leather booklet on the table. Patricia did not even glance at the total. She simply opened her designer purse, pulled out a heavy metal credit card linked directly to Richard's corporate account, and placed it on the silver tray. "Take care of that," she instructed, turning back to her friends to discuss a charity gala. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Patricia tapped her manicured fingernails against the glass table, annoyed by the delay. Finally, the waiter returned, but he was accompanied by the club's general manager. Both men looked incredibly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Anderson," the manager said, keeping his voice low to maintain discretion. "I am terribly sorry, but your card has been declined." The conversation and the table stopped dead. The three socialites leaned in slightly, their predatory instincts activated by the smell of financial blood. "Declined," Patricia scoffed, snatching the card back. "That is absurd. The machine must be broken. It is a premium corporate account. Run it again." "We did run it twice, ma'am," the manager replied softly. "The system is rejecting the authorization completely. Do you happen to have another form of payment?" Patricia felt a hot flush of embarrassment crawl up her neck. Her friends were watching her in absolute silence. She fumbled through her purse and pulled out a personal platinum card, tossing it onto the tray. "Use that one," she snapped, "and I will be speaking to the board about this embarrassing technical failure." The manager walked away. Patricia forced a tight smile at her friends, muttering something about banking security measures being overly sensitive. But when the manager returned 2 minutes later, his face was stern. "I apologize, ma'am, but that card has also been declined. Furthermore, I have been instructed to inform you that your country club membership dues are currently 90 days in arrears. We cannot extend any house credit." One of the women at the table let out a soft, mocking gasp. Patricia felt the blood drain entirely from her face. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her smartphone, desperate to call Richard and scream at him to fix this nightmare. She tapped his contact name, but the call failed instantly. She looked at the top corner of the screen. No service. She was completely stranded. No money, no phone connection, no escape. I must have left my primary card in my other handbag, Patricia stammered, her voice shaking as she stood up, abandoning her dignity. I will need to go home and retrieve it. You do that, Patricia, one of her friends said, her voice dripping with venomous fake pity. Do not worry about the lunch. I will cover it. It seems you are going through a rough patch. Patricia practically ran off the terrace, her face burning with the ultimate high society humiliation. She had been exposed as a fraud. 30 miles away, Brittany was experiencing her own public disaster. She was standing at the checkout counter of an exclusive luxury baby boutique in the city center. A mountain of imported Italian crib linens, cashmere blankets, and designer diaper bags sat piled on the counter. The total was nearly $8,000. Brittany tapped her phone against the payment terminal using the digital wallet linked to Jamal's accounts. The terminal let out a harsh, loud beep. Payment declined. Brittany rolled her eyes at the cashier. Your machine is glitching. Try it again. She tapped her phone a second time. Another loud beep echoed through the quiet upscale store. Other wealthy mothers browsing the racks turned to look. I am sorry, miss, the cashier said politely. The bank is refusing the transaction. Do you have a physical card? Brittany huffed in annoyance, pulling Jamal's supplementary credit card from her wallet and inserting the chip. Declined. She tried her personal card. Declined. She tried a third card. Declined. Brittany's heart began to race. She grabbed her phone to call Jamal and demand he transfer funds immediately, but the screen showed the same glaring error Patricia had seen. No service. Ma'am, the cashier said, her polite tone fading into annoyance. If you cannot provide a valid payment method, I am going to have to ask you to step aside. You are holding up the line. Brittany looked around. 3 other women were staring at her, whispering to each other. The golden child, the woman who had spent her entire morning broadcasting her fake wealth to thousands of followers, was standing in a baby store, utterly broke and unable to even make a phone call. She grabbed her empty designer purse and fled the store in tears, leaving the mountain of expensive baby clothes behind. Less than an hour later, the heavy oak doors of the Connecticut estate slammed open. Patricia stormed into the foyer, her face streaked with ruined makeup. Brittany arrived moments later, sobbing hysterically. Richard was standing in the center of the hallway, clutching the certified foreclosure notice from the bank. He looked like he had aged 20 years since the morning. Jamal walked through the door right behind Brittany. His tie loosened his velvet suit, looking wrinkled and pathetic. He had been forced to pawn his gold watch just to pay for a taxi back to the suburbs because his car lacked gas and his cards were dead. What is happening? Patricia screamed, throwing her useless purse at the wall. My cards are declined. The club manager humiliated me. My phone is completely disconnected. Richard, fix this right now. My cards are dead too. Brittany wailed, pointing an accusing finger at Jamal. You promised me unlimited funds. You said your business was making millions. I looked like a beggar in front of everyone. Shut up! Jamal roared, his fake charm entirely gone, replaced by the desperate rage of a cornered criminal. You think I care about your baby clothes? The feds are investigating my firm. The accounts are frozen. We have nothing. Brittany froze, the color washing out of her face. You lied to me. Richard crushed the foreclosure letter in his fist and threw it onto the marble floor. We are all ruined, he bellowed, silencing the entire room. The bank is demanding $120,000 by Friday. The forbearance agreement is void. Why? Patricia cried out, grasping her hair. We have paid it every month. No, Richard said, his voice dropping to a hollow, haunted whisper. We never paid a single cent. Cassidy paid it. Cassidy paid for everything. The mortgage, the phones, the car insurance. She was keeping us alive. And last night, while we were busy mocking her and throwing her out into the street, she cut the cord. The realization hit the foyer like a physical explosion. The screaming stopped. The complaining ceased. A suffocating, terrifying silence fell over the 4 of them as they stared at the crushed bank notice on the floor. They had not evicted a deadweight tenant. They had proudly executed their only hostage negotiator, and now the executioners were coming for them. The suffocating silence in the foyer lasted for what felt like hours, broken only by the sound of Patricia quietly weeping into her hands. Over the next 48 hours, that silence morphed into a frantic, clawing desperation. The reality of their financial execution set in with brutal efficiency. By Wednesday morning, Richard sat in his study bundled in a heavy winter coat because the utility company had officially cut the gas line to the estate. He stared at a computer screen that displayed nothing but red ink. His manufacturing company was officially dead in the water. The primary suppliers had formally frozen all material shipments and filed breach of contract notices. His payroll accounts bounced, prompting mass walkouts on the factory floor. The empire he had built his entire arrogant persona upon was gone, reduced to a mountain of toxic liabilities. The rest of the house was a mausoleum of fake wealth. Patricia spent her days hiding behind the drawn curtains, terrified to show her face in town. The country club had formally revoked her membership and posted her delinquent account on their internal bulletin board. Brittany paced the empty, unheated nursery, her maternity leave turning into a prison sentence, as she realized she was married to a broke criminal. The designer baby clothes she had been forced to abandon at the boutique were a glaring reminder of her new pathetic reality. She constantly complained about the cold, but no one was listening to her anymore. Nobody was sweating more than Jamal. He was barricaded in the guest bedroom, furiously typing on a cheap burner phone he had bought with the last of his pawned watch cash. The walls of his federal investigation were closing in fast. His defense attorney demanded a massive retainer that Jamal simply did not possess. If he did not secure a massive injection of untraceable capital within the week, he was going to spend the next 15 years of his life in a federal penitentiary. He paced the room, biting his nails, terrified of every car that drove past the estate, thinking it was a federal agent coming to slap cuffs on his wrists. Jamal tapped into the darkest, most desperate corners of his financial network. He messaged former frat brothers, disgraced brokers, and shady hedge fund managers. He begged for leads on ghost investors, venture capitalists looking to offload cash, anyone with deep pockets and a lack of regulatory oversight. Then a ping on a secure messaging app caught his eye. A former colleague, a man who dealt exclusively in high-level offshore real estate transfers, sent him a frantic tip. A massive, completely anonymous cash transaction had just sent shockwaves through the elite Manhattan broker network. Someone had just purchased Island Castle, a notoriously expensive and heavily fortified private island off the northeastern coast. The purchase price was $87 million, paid entirely in liquid cash. The rumor mill was spinning out of control. The buyer was supposedly an eccentric, reclusive tech billionaire who had just exited a massive defense contract and was looking to diversify a new $500 million fortune. Jamal stared at the burner phone screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. A tech billionaire with $500 million in fresh capital hiding on a private island. This was not just a lead. This was a divine intervention. If a billionaire was dropping $87 million in cash on a castle, they would not blink at throwing $10 million into a distressed manufacturing company and a boutique brokerage firm, especially if the pitch was dressed up as a high-yield distressed asset turnaround. Jamal bolted out of the guest room and sprinted down the hallway, bursting into Richard's study without knocking. Richard was sitting with his head in his hands, staring blankly at the foreclosure notice. Jamal slammed his hands down on the desk, his eyes wide and manic, completely dropping any pretense of his usual smooth composure. "We have a lifeline," Jamal gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "I just got a tip from the inside. There is a ghost investor out there, a tech billionaire who just cashed out of a defense contract and bought Island Castle for $87 million in pure cash. They are looking to deploy capital fast away from the traditional banking sector." Richard looked up, his bloodshot eyes narrowing in suspicion. "An anonymous billionaire. Why would they ever meet with us? Our credit is destroyed. My company is insolvent. We do not even have the gas turned on in this house." "Because they are an eccentric tech nerd," Jamal said, pacing the room with frantic energy. "They do not understand traditional manufacturing or boutique finance. We sell them a narrative. We tell them your company has temporary supply chain bottlenecks, but massive infrastructure value. We tell them my firm can leverage their new cash in high-yield secondary markets. We ask for a $10 million bailout and offer them 60% equity. We just need to get in the room. If we can get face to face with this isolated tech geek, we can charm the checkbook right out of their hands. It was a pathetic delusional plan, built entirely on the assumption that a billionaire would be stupid enough to hand them millions without doing a shred of due diligence. But desperate men do not see red flags. They only see life rafts. Richard stood up, the faintest glimmer of hope reigniting the arrogance in his chest. He smoothed the lapels of his wrinkled shirt, desperately trying to channel the powerful executive he used to be. "Find the broker who handled the island transaction," Richard commanded, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and renewed superiority. "Bribe them, beg them, do whatever it takes to get us a pitch meeting on that island. We are going to put on our best suits. We are going to fly out there, and we are going to secure our legacy. This family does not lose, we just need to spin the right story." Bin. Jamal nodded furiously, already dialing his burner phone to track down the estate manager's contact information. They were absolutely convinced that their silver tongues and fake confidence could save them from ruin. They had no idea that they were actively begging for an invitation to walk directly into a slaughterhouse. While Richard and Jamal were busy charting their delusional course toward a supposed tech billionaire, Patricia was fighting her own pathetic battle against reality in the freezing living room. The Connecticut estate felt like a massive, beautifully decorated icebox. Without electricity or gas, the ambient temperature had plummeted, forcing Patricia to wrap herself in two layered cashmere throws just to stop her teeth from chattering. She sat huddled on the expensive designer sofa, glaring at the blank television screen, listening to the muffled, frantic shouts of the men down the hallway. They were banking on a miracle. Patricia, however, was focused on immediate survival. Her bridge club friends had completely frozen her out, ignoring her calls and texts. The country club had officially canceled her membership. She had precisely $14 in her designer wallet, and the pantry was rapidly emptying. She needed a quick, localized injection of cash just to maintain the absolute bare minimum of her daily routine, and her pride would not allow her to beg her wealthy acquaintances. She pulled out her laptop, connecting it to the weak, unstable mobile hotspot Jamal had set up, using his prepaid burner phone. The battery icon glowed a menacing red warning her she had less than 20% power remaining. She opened her email client, her stiff, freezing fingers hovering over the keyboard. There was only one person she knew who was desperate enough for family validation to hand over money. The same person they had viciously thrown out into the cold just days ago. Patricia convinced herself that Cassidy was currently suffering immensely. In Patricia's warped mind, a woman without the backing of her prominent family was nothing. She pictured her eldest daughter sitting on the edge of a stained bed in a cheap, rundown roadside motel, crying into a pillow, completely shattered by the loss of her childhood home. Patricia began to type carefully, crafting a message dripping with weaponized maternal guilt and fake benevolence. "My dearest Cassidy." The email began. "I know that things ended rather poorly on Thanksgiving, but a mother's love is truly unconditional. Your father and I have been terribly worried about you out there on your own. I can only imagine how difficult it must be for you staying in some dreadful motel, probably regretting your dramatic and unnecessary exit. We want you to know that we are willing to forgive your outburst." Patricia paused, rubbing her cold hands together before continuing her fabrication. "In fact, to show our good faith, we want to help you rebuild your relationship with this family. Your father's company is currently undergoing a massive, highly confidential expansion project, and we are experiencing a very brief, temporary cash flow hiccup due to some tied-up assets. If you could wire a small, short-term loan of $10,000 to my personal account, we would consider letting you come back home. Think of it as a gesture of goodwill to prove you are ready to be a contributing member of this family again. I await your prompt reply. Love, Mom." She hit send, a smug, satisfied smile fighting its way through her shivering lips. She genuinely believed Cassidy would weep with gratitude upon reading it. She thought her daughter would instantly transfer whatever pathetic savings she had left, just to buy her way back into the warmth of the family circle. Patricia closed the laptop to save the dying battery, completely convinced she had just solved her immediate crisis with a masterclass in psychological manipulation. 200 miles away, the roaring Atlantic Ocean crashed violently against the jagged stone cliffs of a private island. Cassidy stood on the sprawling, elevated balcony of Island Castle. The morning air was crisp, clean, and entirely invigorating. She was wearing a floor-length silk robe over her tailored lounge clothes, holding a steaming mug of premium custom-roasted coffee prepared just moments ago by her private on-site chef. The estate hummed with the silent, invisible efficiency of extreme, unadulterated wealth. Below her, a team of landscapers manicured the sprawling gardens that stretched toward the private dock. To her left, a sleek twin-engine helicopter rested on a reinforced concrete helipad, its blades gleaming under the morning sun, ready to depart at her absolute whim. She took a slow sip of her coffee, letting the rich flavor coat her tongue as she stared out at the endless expanse of the ocean. Her encrypted smartphone resting on the heavy stone railing chimed softly. Cassidy picked up the device. The biometric scanner verified her identity instantly. A forwarded message from her old personal email address illuminated the screen. She opened the message and read Patricia's words. A quiet, genuinely amused chuckle rumbled in Cassidy's chest, quickly swallowed by the fierce ocean wind. The sheer, towering audacity of the email was breathtaking. The irony was so thick it was almost tangible. Patricia was sitting in a freezing, dark, foreclosed mansion begging for $10,000 and offering the grand prize of allowing Cassidy to return to a house that Cassidy already legally owned. A dreadful motel, Cassidy murmured to herself, looking up from the screen to sweep her gaze across the impenetrable stone battlements and luxury suites of her massive fortress. Her mother was trying to use a $10,000 ransom to assert dominance. Cassidy had tipped her private helicopter pilot half that amount just yesterday for flying through mild turbulence to fetch imported truffles from the mainland. The delusion was terminal. There was no cure for the disease infecting her family, only total eradication. Cassidy did not feel a single ounce of anger. You do not get angry at an ant for trying to lift a boulder. You just watch it crush itself. With a single dismissive flick of her thumb, she tapped the trash icon. The pathetic manipulative email vanished into the digital void, permanently deleted without a single word of response. The heavy glass doors leading to the balcony slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. The head of her private security detail, a towering, sharply dressed professional named Jackson, stepped out onto the stone patio. He held a secure tablet in his left hand, his posture rigid and highly disciplined. "Ma'am," Jackson said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the crashing waves. "We just received an urgent, highly prioritized communication from the elite broker network managing the estate's blind inquiries." Cassidy turned away from the ocean, her silk robe billowing slightly in the wind. She leaned back against the stone railing, crossing her arms. "What is the status, Jackson?" "It is exactly as you predicted," he replied, handing the tablet to her. "A boutique financial brokerage firm and a regional manufacturing CEO are aggressively requesting an emergency audience with the new owner. They are claiming to have a highly lucrative distressed asset turnaround pitch that requires immediate capital deployment. They are practically begging for a face-to-face meeting." Cassidy looked down at the tablet. The names Richard and Jamal were highlighted in the broker's digital report. They had sprinted directly into the crosshairs, driven entirely by their own blinding greed and desperation. A cold, razor-sharp smile spread across Cassidy's face. The board was set. The pieces had moved exactly where she wanted them. "They took the bait," Cassidy said, handing the tablet back to her head of security. "Let the brokers know the island owner will accept a pitch meeting. Tell them to wear their absolute best suits. I want them flying high before we cut the engine." Jackson gave a crisp military nod and turned on his heel to relay the authorization to the mainland brokers. I stepped back inside the master suite, the heavy glass doors sliding shut behind me, instantly sealing out the roar of the Atlantic Ocean. The time for passive observation was officially over. It was time to build the execution block. I strode through the vaulted stone corridors of the estate, heading straight for my private quarters to change. 10 minutes later, I emerged wearing sharp-tailored slate-gray trousers and a crisp white blouse. I summoned my estate manager, Gideon, via the internal smart intercom system. He met me at the entrance of the primary boardroom, holding a secure digital tablet. Gideon, I said, my voice echoing slightly against the polished marble walls. We are hosting 4 guests tomorrow afternoon. I want their transport to be flawlessly executed. Send the twin-engine luxury helicopter to the mainland heliport. Stock the cabin with the most expensive vintage champagne we have in the cellar and a full spread of imported caviar. Gideon nodded, his fingers moving rapidly across his tablet. Understood, ma'am. And regarding their arrival on the island, full VIP protocol. I instructed, maintaining a brisk walking pace. Have the staff line the entrance to greet them. I want them to feel like absolute royalty from the second their feet leave the tarmac. Elevate their egos as high as possible. But security remains uncompromising. Jackson and his men will confiscate all mobile devices, smartwatches, and electronics before they step a single foot inside the castle. Tell them it is standard protocol for a highly secure tech billionaire. They will be far too desperate for the cash to refuse or complain. I dismissed Gideon and walked into the Apex boardroom. This room was a marvel of modern architecture. A massive glass cube protruding directly from the cliffside, suspended hundreds of feet above the crashing waves. A sprawling black marble conference table dominated the center of the room, facing a floor-to-ceiling smart glass wall that doubled as an interactive projection screen. I walked to the head of the table, plugged a military-grade encrypted flash drive into the primary console, and cracked my knuckles. As a cybersecurity architect, compiling data was not just my profession, it was my art form. And today, my canvas was the total financial destruction of my own family. The smart glass wall flickered to life, bathing the darkened room in a cold blue digital glow. I divided the massive screen into 2 distinct sectors. On the left, I prepared the complete unredacted financial autopsy of Richard's manufacturing company. On the right, I opened the digital graveyard of Jamal's boutique brokerage firm. I started with Jamal. Using my specialized decryption tools, I effortlessly bypassed the pathetic low-level firewalls protecting his so-called offshore portfolios. The data cascaded down the screen in real time. I pulled the official Securities and Exchange Commission subpoena, highlighting the exact dates and the specific federal statutes he had violated. But I did not stop there. I dug much deeper, tracing the exact routing numbers of the client funds he had actively embezzled. I created a dynamic color-coded flowchart demonstrating exactly how Jamal had funneled stolen investments into his personal checking accounts. I linked the stolen deposits directly to his credit card statements, showing a side-by-side comparison. The screen displayed his $15,000 purchases at custom velvet suit tailors, his exorbitant luxury car lease payments, and Brittany's endless designer handbag hauls, all paid for with stolen pension funds. The final number flashed in bold red digits at the bottom of the screen. $3.2 million stolen, $0 remaining. Next, I turned my attention to Richard. His corporate bravado was even easier to dismantle. I pulled the internal accounting ledgers of his manufacturing plant. I isolated the exact week he began cooking the books to hide his massive hemorrhage of capital. I projected the fraudulent tax returns he had filed for the past 3 years, highlighting his wildly inflated revenue projections. I found the fake shell companies he had created to hide his mounting liabilities and the forged asset sheets, claiming he owned heavy machinery that had actually been repossessed months ago. To deliver the final blow, I pulled up the bounced payroll records from just 48 hours prior, proving that he was not suffering from a temporary supply chain bottleneck, but absolute, irreversible insolvency. I also made sure to prepare a special visual aid just for Patricia and Brittany. On a secondary slide, I pulled the frozen status of Patricia's country club membership and the time-stamped logs of the exact moment Brittany's cards were declined at the luxury baby boutique. I wanted every single one of them to see their specific failures illuminated in stark contrast to my success. I wanted them to realize that while they were desperately grasping at fake status symbols, I was quietly holding the keys to the entire kingdom. I stepped back, crossing my arms as my eyes scanned the massive wall of financial sins. The data was completely airtight. It was a masterpiece of undeniable guilt. There were no loopholes, no excuses, and absolutely no alternate narratives they could spin. When they sat in this room and looked at this screen, they would be looking into a harsh, high-definition mirror that reflected the ugly, pathetic truth they had spent their entire lives running from. I typed a final command into the console, linking the entire presentation to a single discrete remote control hidden under the lip of the marble table. I then dimmed the boardroom lights entirely, leaving only the natural light pouring in from the ocean view. I walked over to the high-backed black leather chair at the head of the table. I turned it around so it faced the glass wall, completely obscuring whoever sat in it from the boardroom entrance. Everything was perfectly aligned. The trap was set heavily baited with the promise of unimaginable wealth and wired with the explosive truth of their own arrogance. I ran my hand along the cool, smooth surface of the marble table, a profound sense of absolute calm washing over me. I had spent my entire life being gaslit, belittled, and treated like an insignificant speck of dirt. Tomorrow, I would not raise my voice. I would not shed a single tear. I would simply turn the chair around, press a button, and let the raw, unforgiving data serve as the judge, jury, and executioner. 200 miles away, the freezing temperatures inside the Connecticut estate were doing nothing to cool Jamal's feverish pacing. He was staring at the cracked screen of his prepaid burner phone, his thumb hovering over the refresh button of his email client. He had been refreshing the inbox for 14 straight hours. His cuticles were chewed raw. The battery icon dipped to 9%. Then a sharp metallic chime broke the dead silence of the guest bedroom. An email from the elite Manhattan brokerage firm appeared on the screen. The subject line read, "Island Castle Pitch Meeting Confirmed." Jamal opened the email, his eyes darting frantically across the brief, clinical text. The anonymous owner of Island Castle had agreed to a 30-minute audience tomorrow afternoon. Transportation would be provided via private helicopter from the mainland helipad. Jamal let out a sound that was half sob, half triumphant roar. He had done it. He had actually reeled in a whale. In his deluded mind, the meeting was merely a formality. He was a master salesman, and this eccentric tech nerd was nothing more than an open vault waiting to be looted. He kicked the guest room door open and sprinted down the hallway. He skidded into the grand living room where Richard, Patricia, and Brittany were huddled around an unlit fireplace, wearing heavy winter coats indoors, like refugees in a luxury museum. "Get up," Jamal shouted, clapping his hands together with explosive energy. "Get up right now! We are back in the game!" Richard looked up from a stack of final collection notices, his eyes sunken and exhausted. "What are you screaming about, Jamal? We are freezing to death in our own home. We are not freezing, Richard. We are taking a brief intermission." Jamal boasted, his chest puffed out, the swagger completely restored to his posture. "I just secured the meeting. The ghost billionaire on the island accepted the pitch. We fly out tomorrow afternoon on their private chopper." The transformation in the room was instantaneous and utterly nauseating. Patricia threw off her cashmere blankets, her posture snapping back to her usual aristocratic rigidity. Brittany gasped, clutching her pregnant stomach, her eyes wide with sudden ravenous greed. Richard stood up, dropping the collection notices onto the cold floor. "You secured the meeting?" Richard asked, a frantic smile spreading across his flushed face. "I secured the legacy," Jamal corrected aggressively, adjusting the collar of his wrinkled shirt. "I told you I am a closer. This tech guy has 87 million to drop on a castle, which means he has at least another 20 million lying around to pump into your manufacturing plant and my brokerage firm. We walk in there, we dazzle him with our combined business acumen, and we walk out with a blank check." Patricia began pacing the room, her mind instantly shifting back to superficial appearances. "If we are meeting a billionaire on a private island, we cannot walk in there looking like this. We need to project absolute power. We need to look like we do not even need his money. Brittany, you need a new maternity dress, something bespoke. Richard, your current suits are entirely out of season. Mom, my cards are completely dead." Brittany whined, her voice taking on its usual petulant tone. The baby boutique humiliated me yesterday. How are we supposed to buy bespoke anything? Richard rubbed his temples, the reality of their $0 balance briefly interrupting his fantasy. She is right, Patricia. We do not have access to a single line of credit. The bank accounts are frozen solid. Jamal smirked, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, tightly rolled wad of cash. It was exactly $2,000, the absolute last remnants of the cash he had received from pawning his heavy gold watch the day before. It was supposed to be his emergency escape fund if the federal agents showed up at the door, but his arrogance had completely overridden his basic survival instinct. "We are not buying," Jamal announced, slapping the cash down on the cold glass coffee table. "We are renting. There is a high-end boutique rental service in the city that caters to executives who need to look like 10 million bucks for a weekend. $2,000 is enough to secure top-tier designer rentals for all four of us for 24 hours. You want us to wear rented clothes?" Patricia gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically assaulted. Like some sort of common prom teenagers. "It is an investment." Patricia Richards snapped, his eyes locked entirely on the crumpled cash. "Jamal is right. We have to look the part. We put on the armor, we secure the bailout, and by tomorrow night you can buy the entire boutique if you want to." The next 4 hours were a masterclass in pathetic vanity. They piled into Richard's imported Mercedes, which was running on a quarter tank of gas, and drove to the city. They walked into the rental boutique, acting as if they owned the building. Patricia demanded the staff bring her their most exclusive Chanel pieces. Brittany threw a fit until they found a silk maternity gown that perfectly accentuated her baby bump. Richard selected a charcoal Tom Ford suit, and Jamal opted for a sleek, aggressive navy Armani cut. They handed over the entire $2,000, emptying their collective net worth down to literally 0 cents. They drove back to the freezing Connecticut estate carrying garment bags worth more than their current bank accounts. That night they did not pack. They rehearsed. In the freezing dark living room, illuminated only by the flashlight on Jamal's burner phone, they practiced their lies. Jamal paced back and forth, delivering his fraudulent pitch about high-yield secondary markets and explosive offshore returns. Richard practiced his firm handshake and his authoritative tone, memorizing fake statistics about his dead manufacturing company. Brittany practiced looking like the perfect wealthy mother-to-be. They hyped each other up into a state of absolute frenzy. They convinced themselves that this anonymous billionaire was simply a naive nerd who would be mesmerized by their high society charm and polished business jargon. They completely forgot about the eviction notice sitting on the dining room table. They completely forgot about the frozen bank accounts and the massive fraud investigations. They were entirely focused on the golden parachute waiting for them on the island. They went to sleep in their heavy winter coats, shivering in the dark, but their minds were filled with visions of private jets and endless credit limits. They had bet their very last dime on a theatrical performance, entirely oblivious to the fact that they had just purchased front-row tickets to their own execution. The morning light broke through the frosted windows of the Connecticut estate, waking them from their freezing slumber. They did not have the luxury of hot showers or a warm breakfast. Instead, they quickly stripped off their heavy winter coats and stepped into their rented designer armor. The house was a miserable icebox, an undeniable monument to their failure, yet they paraded around the dark hallways as if preparing for a royal coronation. Richard aggressively adjusted his charcoal suit, checking his reflection in the hallway mirror to ensure the flawless tailoring hid his recent weight loss and the deep, exhausted bags under his eyes. Patricia smoothed the wrinkles from her Chanel ensemble, pretending the lack of running water was merely a minor inconvenience rather than a glaring sign of absolute ruin. Brittany wriggled into her bespoke silk maternity gown, complaining loudly about the chill biting at her ankles, while Jamal meticulously checked his reflection, ensuring his navy Armani cut looked sharp enough to mesmerize a reclusive tech mogul. They piled into the Mercedes, holding their breath as Richard turned the key. The engine sputtered before finally roaring to life, the fuel gauge resting terrifyingly below the empty line. They drove the last fumes of gas to the mainland private heliport, in complete silence, terrified that a single wrong turn would leave them stranded on the side of the highway in rented clothes they could not afford to replace. When they pulled up to the private aviation terminal, their collective breath hitched. Sitting on the pristine tarmac was a massive twin-engine black helicopter. It looked like a military-grade transport vehicle wrapped in pure, unadulterated luxury. A pilot in a crisp, spotless uniform stood by the open cabin door waiting for them with professional stoicism. The pilot greeted them with a respectful nod, addressing Richard as Sir, and treating the entire group with the exact level of deference I had explicitly ordered. Jamal puffed out his chest, strutting across the tarmac as if he had chartered the flight himself with his own limitless funds. He offered his hand to help Brittany up the steps, leaning in to whisper about how this was the exact model of chopper he planned to buy once their offshore funds cleared. The interior of the helicopter was breathtaking. Plush cream-colored leather seats faced each other in a spacious cabin lined with polished walnut paneling. Soundproofed headsets rested on the armrests, promising a smooth, quiet journey across the Atlantic. Richard sank into his seat, letting out a long, heavy sigh of relief. This was the environment he believed he was fundamentally entitled to. Patricia crossed her legs elegantly, running her manicured hand over the supple leather. Her previous humiliation at the country club was entirely forgotten in the face of this new towering display of wealth. They strapped themselves in their stomachs empty and their bank accounts drained to absolute zero, but their egos inflated to the size of hot air balloons. The helicopter rotors spun to life, creating a powerful hum that vibrated through the floorboards. As they lifted off the ground and banked smoothly toward the open ocean, Jamal noticed a built-in refrigeration console between the seats. He slid the panel open to reveal a silver bucket overflowing with crushed ice. Resting perfectly in the center was a bottle of vintage champagne, flanked by 4 crystal flutes and a small tin of imported caviar. The sheer extravagance of the gesture washed over them completely, erasing any lingering doubts. Jamal pulled the bottle out, his eyes widening at the gold-embossed label. He knew enough about luxury brands to recognize that a single pour from this vintage cost more than his entire monthly car lease. He popped the cork, the celebratory sound barely muffled by the roar of the helicopter blades. He poured 4 glasses, handing them out to the family with a triumphant grin. They clinked the crystal flutes together mid-air, toasting to their impending salvation. They were sipping $1,000 champagne on an empty stomach, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman they despised had selected that exact bottle to mock their financial starvation. Patricia took a delicate sip, the crisp, expensive liquid warming her chest and fueling her arrogance. She turned her head to look out the reinforced glass window. Below them, the dark, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean stretched out toward the horizon. The view was magnificent, a perfect backdrop for her resurgent superiority complex. She let out a sharp, genuine laugh, shaking her head as she looked at Richard and Jamal. "Imagine if Cassidy could see us now," Patricia said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction over the headset intercom. "She is probably eating instant noodles in a basement while we are flying to a castle." Brittany let out a loud snort, nearly spilling her champagne onto her rented maternity dress. "She probably had to pawn her laptop just to pay for a motel room," Brittany added, resting her hand protectively on her pregnant belly. "It is honestly poetic justice. She refused to support this family, and now she gets to watch us ascend to the absolute top tier of society without her." Richard chuckled, taking a generous scoop of the caviar with a pearl spoon. "She made her bed, Patricia. Let her sleep in it. We have a billionaire to impress. We do not have time to worry about a resentful dropout." Jamal swirled the champagne in his glass, leaning forward to look out the window. "Exactly, Richard. We walk into this meeting, we project absolute dominance, and we take control of the narrative. This tech guy has $87 million to throw at a rock in the ocean. He is going to be begging us to manage his liquid capital by the time I finish the pitch deck. I am going to secure a $10 million injection before we even finish the appetizers." Patricia nodded enthusiastically, taking another sip of her drink. "We just need to remind him of our social pedigree. New money always craves the validation of old money. We give him a taste of our class and he will hand over the checkbook just to feel like he belongs in our exclusive circle." The helicopter banked slightly, cutting through a low bank of dense coastal clouds. As the gray mist cleared, a massive, imposing structure materialized on the horizon. Island Castle loomed out of the dark ocean like a fortress ripped from a cinematic masterpiece. Jagged stone cliffs rose vertically from the churning waves topped by sprawling battlements and hyper-modern glass architecture. It was a flawless hybrid of ancient power and billionaire security. Brittany gasped, pressing her hands against the cold window. "It is massive," she whispered, her greed practically fogging the glass. "Look at the size of the private dock. They have a mega yacht moored down there." Richard sat up straight, aggressively adjusting his silk tie. "Remember the plan, everyone? We do not look impressed. We act like this is just another Tuesday. We belong here." Jamal finished his champagne in one large gulp, placing the empty crystal flute back into the holder. He cracked his knuckles, rolling his shoulders to loosen the tension in his rented Armani suit. "I am ready to close this deal. Let us go take this nerd for everything he is worth." The helicopter descended smoothly, its massive rotors whipping the coastal wind into a frenzy, as the reinforced concrete helipad of Island Castle rushed up to meet them. The landing gears touched down with a heavy, satisfying thud. The engines began to wind down, shifting from a deafening roar to a low mechanical hum. Jamal unbuckled his seatbelt, first stepping out of the cabin with his chest puffed out, fully prepared to conquer the island. Richard followed, offering a hand to Patricia, while Brittany carefully navigated the steps in her rented maternity gown, desperate to maintain her illusion of high society grace. The freezing ocean spray whipped across their faces, instantly ruining Patricia's meticulously styled hair, but she did not dare complain. Standing at the edge of the helipad, waiting for them with absolute stillness, was Jackson. My head of security looked like a special forces operative poured into an immaculate tailored black suit. His posture was rigid, his expression entirely unreadable. Flanking him were two more security personnel, identical in their sharp, intimidating presence. "Welcome to Island Castle, Jackson," said his voice, booming effortlessly over the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the jagged cliffs below. "The owner is expecting you. However, before we proceed past the outer perimeter, I must enforce the estate security protocols." Jackson stepped forward, holding out a velvet-lined security tray. "All mobile devices, smartwatches, and electronic recording equipment must be surrendered immediately. The owner operates under strict military-grade confidentiality agreements. No outside signals are permitted within the inner sanctum." Jamal bristled, his fake authority instantly challenged by the imposing guard. "I am a managing director of a financial firm," Jamal stated, puffing his chest out to match Jackson's height. "I need my device on me for emergency market alerts. You can tell your boss I will keep it on silent." Jackson did not blink. He did not move the tray. He simply stared at Jamal with dead cold eyes. "The protocol is non-negotiable, sir. Surrender the electronics or the helicopter pilot will be instructed to return you to the mainland immediately." Patricia practically shoved Jamal aside, her desperation overriding his fragile male ego. "Do not be ridiculous, Jamal," she hissed hurriedly, pulling her dead smartphone from her designer purse and tossing it onto the velvet tray. "It is perfectly understandable. We are dealing with extreme wealth here. Just hand over the phone." Richard nodded frantically, ripping his own device from his pocket and dropping it onto the tray. "We respect the owner's privacy," Richard assured Jackson with a nervous, overly eager smile. "Absolute discretion is how we conduct all of our business." Defeated, Jamal unclasped his smartwatch and dropped his burner phone onto the tray. Brittany followed suit, pouting slightly, as her only connection to her fake social media audience was confiscated. With their devices secured, Jackson nodded sharply to the secondary guards, who stepped aside to open the massive reinforced steel gates leading into the castle courtyard. "Please follow me," Jackson commanded, turning on his heel. "Do not stray from the designated path." The walk through the estate was a masterclass in psychological intimidation. The family was led through sprawling, impeccably manicured botanical gardens that defied the harsh coastal climate. They walked past a series of biometric security checkpoints, each one glowing with a soft, pulsing blue light. The walls of the outer corridors were constructed from imported dark stone, adorned with genuine, priceless, modernist artwork that made the fake antique vases back in their Connecticut mansion look like cheap garage sale finds. Brittany was breathing heavily, the rented silk gown clinging uncomfortably to her pregnant frame, but she forced herself to keep walking without complaint. Her eyes darted wildly across the opulent surroundings, silently calculating the sheer net worth required to maintain this level of isolated luxury. Patricia walked beside Richard, her manicured fingers gripping his arms so tightly her knuckles were white. She was vibrating with a toxic mix of intense intimidation and ravenous greed. This was the exact lifestyle she felt she inherently deserved, and she was already imagining herself sipping tea on the private docks. Richard wiped a fresh bead of cold sweat from his upper lip. His rented charcoal suit felt stifling in the climate-controlled halls. He kept adjusting his tie, mentally repeating the fraudulent revenue numbers of his dead manufacturing company. He needed to sound completely unflappable. He needed to sound like a man who did not desperately need a $10 million handout just to keep the lights on. Jackson led them down a final expansive hallway, lined with floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass that offered an unbroken, terrifyingly high view of the Atlantic Ocean. At the end of the corridor stood a pair of massive, imposing black oak doors. The boardroom, Jackson announced, stopping directly in front of the doors. He pressed his thumb against a digital scanner seamlessly integrated into the wood. A mechanical lock clicked open with a heavy, satisfying thud. "The owner will see you now." Jackson pushed the double doors open, gesturing for the four of them to enter. They stepped into the room and their collective breath hitched in their throats. The boardroom was an architectural marvel, a colossal glass cube extending directly out over the cliff edge. It felt as though they were suspended entirely in midair above the churning ocean. The natural light was intense, bouncing off a sprawling 30-foot black marble conference table that commanded the center of the room. There were no assistants. There were no junior executives. The room was perfectly unnervingly silent, save for the muffled sound of the waves crashing hundreds of feet below. At the absolute far end of the long marble table, positioned against the massive glass wall facing the ocean, sat a high-backed black leather executive chair. The chair was turned completely away from the entrance, presenting only its dark leather back to the arriving guests. The person sitting in it was entirely obscured from view. The family stood frozen at the opposite end of the table. Their rented shoes sank into the plush, dark carpet. They did not dare take a seat without being invited. The atmosphere in the room was so thick with tension, it felt practically suffocating. Jamal leaned slightly toward Richard, keeping his voice to an almost imperceptible whisper. "Let me do the talking first. I will hook him with the offshore yields, then you come in with the infrastructure play. Just project power." Richard gave a stiff, jerky nod, his throat completely dry. Patricia stood perfectly upright, wearing her most polished aristocratic smile, ready to charm the eccentric billionaire the second he turned around. Brittany smoothed the front of her dress, practicing a look of serene, wealthy motherhood. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a unified front of absolute frauds. Their bank accounts were empty, their credit was destroyed, their reputations were hanging by a single frayed thread. But in this exact moment, they still believed they were the smartest people in the room. They held their breath, their hearts pounding in unison, waiting for the mysterious billionaire to turn around so they could pitch the lies that would save their lives. The heavy leather chair began to rotate. The mechanical hum of its swivel base was the only sound in the cavernous glass boardroom. It turned slowly, deliberately, maximizing the agonizing suspense that had completely paralyzed my family. Richard stood a little taller. Patricia plastered on her most radiant, practiced smile. Jamal took a deep breath, preparing to launch into his fraudulent pitch. Then the chair locked into place, facing them directly. I did not smile. I did not offer a greeting. I simply sat there, leaning back against the dark leather, my hands resting calmly on the armrests. I was wearing a bespoke, razor-sharp, slate-gray power suit, tailored to absolute perfection. My hair was styled in a sleek, uncompromising cut, and my posture radiated the kind of absolute, untouchable authority that cannot be faked. The reaction was instantaneous and profoundly satisfying. The eager, desperate smiles melted off their faces like wax held to a flame. Patricia let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp, her manicured hand flying up to cover her mouth. Her designer purse slipped from her grip and hit the plush carpet with a dull thud. Richard physically staggered backward, his eyes wide and unblinking, looking as though he had just seen a ghost materialize in the center of the room. Brittany froze entirely, her mouth hanging open in a silent, comical circle of pure shock. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. The cognitive dissonance in the room was so thick it was almost suffocating. Their brains simply could not process the visual information they were receiving. The woman sitting in the billionaire chair was supposed to be a pathetic homeless dropout crying in a cheap motel. She was not supposed to be sitting at the apex of a hyper-secure island fortress looking like a corporate executioner. Jamal was the first to break the silence. His fragile male ego simply refused to accept the reality unfolding in front of him. His brain aggressively rejected the truth, frantically constructing an alternate narrative that allowed him to maintain his fake superiority. He let out a loud, booming laugh. It was a harsh, nervous sound that echoed awkwardly against the glass walls. He shook his head, running a hand over his freshly faded haircut, and pointed a finger at me. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." Jamal chuckled, his voice dripping with aggressive disbelief. "Cassidy, seriously, you work here?" Richard blinked rapidly, grasping onto Jamal's delusion like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. He let out a shaky breath, aggressively adjusting his silk tie. "Of course," Richard muttered, his voice trembling slightly. "Of course she works here. She does computer work. She must be on the IT staff or something." Patricia recovered her aristocratic posture instantly, her shock transforming into blistering, self-righteous anger. She glared at me, her eyes flashing with pure venom. "Cassidy, what on earth are you doing sitting in that chair?" Patricia hissed, her voice echoing sharply across the long marble table. "Get up immediately. Do you have any idea how important this meeting is? We are here to see the owner of this island. If your employer walks in and sees you playing pretend in his boardroom, you will be fired on the spot." Brittany scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes and crossing her arms over her rented maternity gown. "Honestly, this is so typical," Brittany whined. "We fly all the way out here for a multi-million-dollar business pitch, and my sister is the glorified receptionist. Cassidy, stop trying to ruin our moment. Go get your boss right now. Tell him Richard and Jamal are ready to present, and bring us some sparkling water while we wait. My feet are killing me." Jamal took a confident step forward, leaning his knuckles against the edge of the black marble table. He flashed me his signature predatory smile, the exact same smile he wore when he threw that $100 bill onto my dinner plate. "Come on, Cass," Jamal said, using that patronizing nickname I despised. "The joke is over. You had your fun sitting in the big chair. Now be a good assistant and go fetch the billionaire. We have very serious high-level financial matters to discuss, and we do not have time to play games with the help." I did not move. I did not blink. I did not utter a single word in response to their pathetic, desperate barrage of insults. Their arrogance was blinding them to the obvious truth. They were standing in a fortress that required military-grade clearance to enter, yet they somehow believed a low-level assistant could casually commandeer the master boardroom. I let them drown in their own stupidity for a few moments longer, savoring the absolute silence I maintained in the face of their demands. Slowly, I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My movements were calm, deliberate, and entirely devoid of urgency. I withdrew a thick, heavy document printed on premium watermarked legal parchment. It was the master deed to Island Castle. I placed the document flat on the polished black marble surface of the table. I placed my fingertips on the edge of the heavy parchment. With one smooth, forceful push, I slid the document down the center of the massive table. The thick paper made a sharp hissing sound as it glided across the smooth stone. It traveled the entire 30-foot length of the table, slowing down perfectly before coming to a gentle halt directly in front of Jamal and Richard. "Look at it," I thought to myself, maintaining my absolute icy silence. "Look at the reality you refuse to accept." Jamal frowned, highly annoyed by my refusal to speak. He looked down at the document resting near his hands. Richard leaned in closer, squinting to read the elegant, bold typography printed at the very top of the page. The room grew impossibly quiet. Only the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs outside filled the silence. Jamal reached out and picked up the document. His eyes scanned the first few lines. I watched his face closely, waiting for the exact moment the illusion shattered. It happened in an instant. The arrogant smirk vanished from his lips, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of absolute, unadulterated horror. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy parchment rattled in his grip. "What does it say?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking with sudden, uncontrollable panic. "Jamal, what is it?" Jamal could not speak. His throat worked silently as his eyes remained glued to the bold, capitalized letters near the bottom of the page. He was staring directly at the purchase price. $87 million, paid in full. And right below that staggering, impossible number was the undisputed, legally binding signature of the sole proprietor, Cassidy. Jamal dropped the document onto the table as if the paper itself had caught fire. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out slightly, forcing him to catch his balance against Richard. He looked up at me, sitting perfectly still at the head of the table, bathed in the natural light pouring in from the ocean view. The terrifying, crushing truth finally penetrated his thick skull. There was no eccentric tech nerd. There was no ghost investor coming to save them. The billionaire they had flown out here to beg for their survival was the exact same woman they had mercilessly evicted from her own home. I did not give them a single second to process the monumental weight of their own stupidity. Before Richard could formulate a pathetic excuse, or Patricia could attempt to backtrack her insults, I reached under the lip of the black marble table and pressed a hidden button. The motorized blackout shades descended seamlessly over the floor-to-ceiling windows, plunging the room into an intense cinematic twilight. A heartbeat later, the massive smart glass wall directly behind me flared to life, casting a stark, icy blue light across their terrified faces. "Welcome to your pitch meeting," I said, my voice echoing with absolute clinical detachment. "You came here seeking a $10 million bailout to rescue a highly lucrative distressed asset turnaround. You claim to be titans of industry, so let us do what any responsible billionaire investor does before deploying capital. Let us conduct a thorough due diligence review of your actual net worth." I clicked the discreet remote in my hand. The left half of the massive glass screen populated with a highly detailed, color-coded flowchart. At the very top, blazing in high definition, was a scanned copy of a formal federal document. Jamal let out a choked gasp, his knees finally giving out completely. He collapsed heavily into one of the plush leather boardroom chairs, his rented Armani suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. His hands gripped the armrest so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white. "This is a subpoena from the Securities and Exchange Commission," I narrated, pacing slowly back and forth in front of the illuminated wall. "It details an active 8-month covert investigation into your boutique brokerage firm. But we do not need to wait for the federal prosecutors to build their case, Jamal. Because I already did the math for them." I clicked the remote again. The screen zoomed in on a series of offshore bank transfers. I highlighted the exact routing numbers. "Here we see the pension funds you actively embezzled from your most vulnerable clients. And right next to it, we see where that money actually went. It did not go into high-yield Cayman Island bonds. It went directly to the custom tailor who made your velvet suits. It went to the leasing company for your luxury cars. It went to the high-end maternity boutiques that Brittany frequents so she can pretend to be a prominent socialite." Brittany let out a sharp, horrifying shriek, stepping away from Jamal, as if he were suddenly highly contagious. "You stole the money," she cried out, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You told me we were rich. You told me my baby was going to inherit an empire." "You are completely broke," I stated, staring directly at my brother-in-law. The screen flashed a giant, undeniable 0 at the bottom of the ledger. "You embezzled over $3 million to maintain a fake persona, and now you have absolutely nothing left except a guaranteed minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Your pitch is declined, Jamal." I did not pause to let the devastation settle. I turned my attention to the right side of the screen and clicked the remote. A dizzying array of spreadsheets, tax returns, and unpaid invoices flooded the glass wall. Richard stumbled backward, clutching his chest as if he were having a physical heart attack. His face was entirely devoid of color, matching the pale gray of the carpet beneath his feet. "And now for the family patriarch," I continued, my voice remaining surgically precise. "Richard, you came here to sell me on a temporary supply chain bottleneck. You came to tell me that your manufacturing plant just needed a bridge loan to unlock massive infrastructure value. I clicked the remote, bringing up a massive red graph that charted a catastrophic downward spiral. This is your internal accounting ledger for the past 36 months, I explained, pointing at the free-falling red line. You have been actively cooking the books to hide a massive, uncontrollable hemorrhage of capital. You filed fraudulent tax returns claiming inflated revenues to secure secondary loans you had no intention of repaying. Here is the asset sheet claiming you own heavy machinery that was actually repossessed by creditors half a year ago. And here in bold red ink are the bounced payroll checks from just 2 days ago that caused your entire factory floor to walk out. Richard was hyperventilating, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the undeniable proof of his total failure. Patricia grabbed his arm, her fingernails digging into his rented charcoal suit. Tell her it is a lie, Richard. She pleaded, her aristocratic facade completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. Tell her the business is fine. Tell her we have assets. He cannot tell you that, Mom, I interjected, pulling up one final document on the screen. Because he knows I have the exact notice of default that was delivered to the Connecticut estate yesterday morning. The same estate you currently have no gas or electricity running to. The company is completely insolvent. You are not experiencing a temporary cash flow hiccup. You are entirely, irreversibly bankrupt. Patricia let out a wretched sob, her knees buckling slightly as the full weight of their poverty crashed down upon her. She looked at the giant blue screen as if it were an oncoming train. Her social standing, her country club memberships, her entire identity had just been vaporized into digital dust. I turned off the projector. The room plunged back into twilight for a brief second before the blackout shades automatically retracted, flooding the boardroom with blinding natural sunlight from the ocean once again. The bright light felt harsh and unforgiving, exposing every single drop of sweat on Jamal's forehead and every terrified deep wrinkle on Richard's face. I walked back to the head of the table and leaned against my leather chair. I looked at the four of them. They looked like completely different people from the arrogant, sneering family who had boarded a helicopter just an hour ago. Their rented clothes looked ridiculous. Their postures were broken. Their towering egos had been surgically extracted and pulverized right in front of their eyes. The financial autopsy was complete. It had taken me exactly 4 minutes to completely dismantle the illusions they had spent decades building. I had not raised my voice once. I had not called them a single derogatory name. I simply let the numbers do the talking, and the numbers proved that they were nothing more than parasitic frauds. The sheer weight of that realization crushed whatever fragile composure Brittany had left. The golden child, the woman who had built her entire identity on being superior, suddenly snapped. She let out a guttural, hyperventilating wail that pierced the quiet of the boardroom. She grabbed the fabric of her rented silk maternity gown, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into her thighs as she collapsed onto the plush carpet. "You ruined my life!" Brittany screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Jamal, who was still slumped lifelessly in his chair. "You promised me an empire. You told me my baby was going to grow up in luxury. You are going to prison and I am going to be a single mother living on the street." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing with a frantic, ugly intensity. There was no social media filter here. There was no carefully curated angle. It was the raw, unedited breakdown of a woman who had just realized she was entirely destitute and legally tethered to a federal criminal. Patricia stared at her weeping daughter, then looked at Richard, who was completely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the financial graveyard projected on the glass wall. The aristocratic illusion Patricia had spent decades cultivating was dead. The country club, the luxury cars, the lavish luncheons, they were all gone. The only thing standing between her and absolute poverty was the woman she had viciously mocked and evicted just days ago. Patricia's knees buckled. The woman who had worn her pearls like a crown and treated service workers like peasants dropped straight down onto the boardroom floor. Her rented Chanel skirt dragged against the carpet as she crawled forward, closing the distance between us. Tears streamed down her face, dragging thick streaks of mascara across her cheeks. "Cassidy, my beautiful daughter." Patricia wept. her voice cracking as she reached out her trembling hands, hovering just inches from my polished leather shoes. Please, you have to understand. We were just confused. We were stressed about your father's company. We did not mean any of the things we said. I looked down at her, my face a mask of absolute unyielding stone. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I looked at the woman who had called me a failure, who had allowed her son-in-law to throw money in my face, and I felt nothing but cold analytical detachment. We are blood. Cassidy! Patricia begged, her voice rising to a hysterical screech. We are a family. You cannot just leave us with nothing. You have $500 million. You could save your father's company right now. You could pay off Jamal's debts and keep him out of prison. Please, I am your mother. You owe us your life. Family does not throw each other out into the freezing cold on Thanksgiving. Patricia, I stated, my voice echoing sharply across the vast room. Family does not bleed their children dry to fund fake luxury lifestyles. You do not get to play the blood card only when your bank accounts hit zero. I stepped away from her grasping hands and walked deliberately toward a hidden compartment seamlessly built into the black marble conference table. I pressed a concealed panel and a shallow drawer slid open. I reached inside and pulled out a crisp, heavy manila folder. It was an exact, deliberate visual replica of the folder Patricia had tossed at my dinner plate. I walked back to the head of the table. Richard finally snapped out of his catatonic trance, his bloodshot eyes tracking my movements. Jamal slowly lifted his head, his face slick with cold sweat. Patricia scrambled up from the floor, leaning heavily against the table for support, her breath catching in her throat. I placed the manila folder flat on the polished stone. With one smooth, forceful push, I slid it directly down the center of the massive table. It glided across the surface and bumped gently against Richard's hands. "What is this?" Richard whispered, his voice completely broken, sounding like a frightened child rather than a corporate titan. "I bought the bank's debt." I announced, my words slicing through the room like a scalpel. When your automated mortgage payment bounced, the bank demanded a balloon payment of $120,000 to halt the foreclosure. You spent your last $2,000 renting those pathetic clothes, so you obviously missed the deadline. I stepped in this morning. I paid the bank in full and acquired the deed to the property. Richard opened the folder with shaking fingers. He stared at the legal transfer of ownership. The color drained from his face entirely as the reality set in. I now officially own the Connecticut estate. I continued maintaining eye contact with my father. And as the new owner, I am enforcing the exact same standards you established. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your things and get out of my house. Patricia let out a horrifying shriek, covering her ears, as if trying to physically block out my words. "You cannot do this," she wailed. "Where will we go? We have no money. We have no credit." "You will figure it out," I said, perfectly mirroring the cold tone Richard had used on me. "You are adults. Stop acting like you are the victims here. You are guests in the legacy that I actually built, and your welcome has officially worn out. If I find a single scratch on the walls or a single piece of your garbage left behind, I will personally send my security team to drag you out onto the street." Brittany continued to sob on the floor, rocking back and forth, entirely incapable of processing the eviction. Jamal sat frozen, his eyes wide and vacant. He knew he was going to prison, and now he knew he would be leaving his pregnant wife completely homeless in the process. I walked slowly around the edge of the table until I was standing directly next to Jamal. The arrogant finance broker who had tried to humiliate me was now a ruined, sweating mess. I reached into the tailored pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed against a piece of paper I had kept specifically for this exact moment. I pulled out a crisp, heavily creased $100 bill, the exact same bill Jamal had thrown onto my gravy-stained plate. I held it up between my fingers, letting it catch the natural light pouring in from the ocean view windows. Jamal stared at the bill, a fresh wave of nausea washing over his face as he recognized it. "I tell you what, Jamal," I said, my voice dripping with the same weaponized fake pity he had used on me. "Because I am a generous person, I am going to help you out. I know things are going to be incredibly tight for you now that your offshore portfolios are seized by the federal government. I know someone facing a 15-year prison sentence is going to struggle to find a moving company. With a precise flick of my wrist, I tossed the $100 bill. It fluttered through the air and landed squarely on his lap, resting against the dark fabric of his rented Armani trousers. Use it to rent a U-Haul, I said, my lips curling into a sharp, victorious smile. Or maybe use it to put a down payment on a cardboard box. Just consider it an early Christmas present from the successful side of the family. You are welcome. Jamal did not touch the $100 bill. It lay on his lap, a mocking testament to his utter destruction. He simply stared at it, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. The entire room had been drained of its previous manic energy, replaced by the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of a graveyard. They were out of plays, they were out of lies, they were entirely out of time. I stepped back from his chair and walked calmly to the master control panel, seamlessly integrated into the edge of the black marble table. I did not look at any of them. They had ceased to be my family the moment they handed me that eviction notice. Now they were simply unauthorized personnel trespassing on my private property. I placed my finger over the brushed steel security button and pressed it firmly. Less than 2 seconds later, the massive black oak doors swung open. Jackson strode into the boardroom, his face a mask of intimidating professional indifference. Behind him walked 4 additional security operatives, all built like absolute mountains, dressed in immaculate tactical suits. They moved with terrifying precision, fanning out across the room to surround the table. "The meeting is concluded," I announced, my voice carrying the finality of a gavel striking wood. "Escort these individuals off my island immediately. Ensure they board the helicopter and do not allow them to take a single item that does not belong to them." Patricia let out a fresh, piercing wail, scrambling to her feet. Her rented Chanel skirt caught on the edge of the chair, nearly tripping her as she lunged toward me. "Cassidy, please, you cannot send us back there. We have no gas. We have no electricity. The bank will lock the doors. We will be homeless." Jackson stepped smoothly into her path, his broad chest forming an impenetrable wall of muscle between my mother and me. He did not touch her, but his sheer presence forced her to stop dead in her tracks. "Step back, ma'am," Jackson ordered, his voice dangerously low. "It is time to leave." Richard finally snapped out of his catatonic daze. He stood up, his rented charcoal suit hanging awkwardly off his slumped shoulders. The commanding patriarch who had aggressively banged his fist on my dining room table was entirely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified old man, staring into the abyss of his own failures. "Come on, Patricia," Richard whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "It is over. We have to go." Brittany was still on the floor, weeping hysterically into her hands, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of her ruined future. 2 of the security guards stepped forward gently but firmly, grasping her by the arms and hoisting her to her feet. She did not fight them. She just sobbed, her mascara completely washed away, leaving her face a splotchy, miserable mess. Jamal stood up slowly, the $100 bill slipping off his lap and fluttering onto the carpet. He did not bother picking it up. He looked completely hollowed out, a dead man walking toward a federal prison sentence. They were marched out of the boardroom in a single pathetic file line. Patricia continued to cry, looking back over her shoulder, desperately hoping to see a shred of hesitation or mercy on my face. She found none. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, watching them go with the cold, analytical detachment of a scientist observing a successful experiment. The heavy oak doors pulled shut behind them with a solid, echoing thud, sealing the room in absolute tranquility once again. The distant, muffled sounds of their cries echoed faintly down the stone corridors for a few moments, growing softer and softer until they were completely swallowed by the ambient hum of the ocean waves crashing outside. I was alone. The silence in the massive glass cube was profound and beautiful. The discreet side door near the master suite opened with a soft mechanical hiss. Gideon, my estate manager, stepped into the room. He carried a polished silver tray bearing a single flawlessly crafted crystal flute and an open bottle of the estate's most exclusive rare vintage champagne. He approached me with quiet dignity, placing the tray gently onto the black marble table. "Excellent timing, Gideon," I said, my voice softening now that the performance was officially concluded. "Your guests are currently boarding the transport, ma'am," Gideon replied, pouring the bubbling golden liquid into the crystal flute. "The pilot has confirmed the mainland coordinates. They will be deposited back at the public heliport within 30 minutes. I picked up the glass, the cool crystal feeling heavy and substantial against my fingers. "Thank you. You are dismissed." Gideon bowed his head respectfully and exited the room, leaving me alone in my fortress. I walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling smart glass wall, my heels clicking rhythmically against the dark stone. I stopped inches from the glass, looking out over the sprawling manicured gardens and the jagged cliffs dropping off into the churning Atlantic. Down on the helipad, the massive twin-engine helicopter roared to life. The immense force of the spinning rotors whipped the coastal mist into a violent frenzy. Through the tinted windows of the aircraft, I could barely make out the shadowy silhouettes of my family. They were flying back to a reality they had created entirely through their own arrogance and greed. They were flying back to frozen bank accounts, locked doors, federal indictments, and total social disgrace. They were returning to a life of absolute ruin, and they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. I lifted the crystal flute, letting the pale gold champagne catch the bright coastal sunlight. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The vintage was crisp, complex, and tasted like absolute, undeniable victory. The helicopter lifted off the concrete pad, banking sharply against the wind, before accelerating toward the distant mainland horizon. I watched it become a smaller and smaller speck against the gray clouds until it vanished completely from sight. The sky was clear. The island was secure. The toxic anchor that had dragged me down for 33 years was permanently severed and cast into the abyss. I lowered the glass, my reflection staring back at me in the massive window. I saw a woman who had survived manipulation, who had outsmarted predators, and who had built an impenetrable empire from the ground up. I turned away from the glass, walking back toward the center of my boardroom, ready to command the future that belonged entirely to me. The shadows of the past faded into the dark marble, leaving only the brilliant, blinding light of a woman who had finally won. The powerful narrative of Cassidy's calculated retaliation teaches a profound lesson about the true nature of family and self-worth. It vividly illustrates that blood relations do not guarantee loyalty, and that true power comes from recognizing your own value, even when those closest to you attempt to diminish it. Cassidy's journey from being the family scapegoat to an empowered billionaire underscores the importance of setting firm boundaries and refusing to allow others' toxic delusions to dictate your reality. It is a reminder that you do not have to absorb cruelty to keep the peace. Have you ever had to establish boundaries with toxic family members to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below.